think I'm going to get started. Everyone was having so much fun at the coffee table that we're running a little tiny bit late, but that's okay. We'll be able to make that up on our lunch break. Thank you for joining us here today for a discussion of the rules-based order in Antarctica and global challenges. I'm Rebecca Pincus, Director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center. I'm going to start off with a couple of health and safety updates. As you can see, there are emergency exits located at the left and right rear of this auditorium. In case of emergency, please exit up the stairs to the street level. Restrooms are on that side of the auditorium to the left down a clearly marked hallway. Please let us know if you have any access issues. The agenda for this conference is available by scanning the QR code on the screen that is also posted out in the reception area. Again, please let us know if you have any questions or if there's anything we can do to make your time here more comfortable. For those of you who are not familiar with the Wilson Center, I want to explain that we are a think tank mandated by the U.S. Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. Established as a living memorial to President Wilson in 1968, the Wilson Center is today home to 17 topical and regional programs. These include the Environmental Change and Security Program and the Latin America Program, both of whom we are partnering with today on this conference. We are also delighted and grateful to partner with the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. I also want to thank our event sponsors, Lindblad Expeditions, Battelle, and Hurtigruten, for helping to make this program possible. This event was born out of recognition that the set of issues in Antarctica, geopolitical competition, the climate change crisis, disruptive new technologies, in many ways is a microcosm of broader global challenges confronting the United States and its allies. The Wilson Center prides itself on tackling policy issues that aren't being covered by everyone else. We surface issues that deserve more attention here in DC. U.S. Antarctic policy is one of those. Today and tomorrow we will hear about rapidly shrinking ice sheets and China's growing presence in Antarctica. We'll hear about growing number of tourists, satellites, and safety issues. We will hear concerns about the U.S. ability to be present in Antarctica. And yet official U.S. policy on Antarctica has not been updated since the 1990s. I would ask you, where in the world is the global rules-based order more significant than Antarctica? It is a continent set aside and protected under the terms of a remarkable global agreement, where no state exercises sovereignty and where military activity is banned. I will ask you, where in the world is climate change more significant than Antarctica? With ice sheets that hold 70% of the world's fresh water, which, if melted, would raise sea levels by 200 feet and shut down global ocean circulation. Ice sheets that are at record lows today. This is why we are here today, to learn about an incredibly important place and set of issues. I'm honored to introduce our opening speaker, Dr. Jane Lubchenco, Deputy Director for Climate and the Environment in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Dr. Lubchenco formerly served as administrator of NOAA and as the first U.S. science envoy for the ocean. She has been recognized with the MacArthur Genius Award and has founded multiple organizations aimed at improving science communications. I can think of no better opening speaker, and we're fortunate to have Dr. Lubchenco here to kick off our science, policy, foreign affairs program. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Becca. Good morning, everyone. So wonderful to hear all the exciting voices and the buzz of exchanges of information before we got started. This is a really important community, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you. I'm honored, deeply honored, to have this opportunity to open this first of its kind conference this morning. Perhaps overdue, but nonetheless very much needed in today's world. Before I dive in, I want to recognize the people in this room, the people online, out in the field, and on or under the ice, working to ensure that Antarctica continues, quote, forever, to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes, unquote, and to conserve the remarkable wilderness of the seventh continent and the Southern Ocean. Over 2 decades ago now, I had the great privilege of visiting Antarctica for the very first time. I was with the National Science Board. We were there to evaluate a number of the National Science Foundation projects and NSF's Antarctic program. I trekked across the Ross Ice Shelf to assist a team of physiologists who were dropping fishing lines into holes that they had drilled through the shelf to catch ice fish and reveal the secrets of the recently discovered antifreeze that they contain. I joined an NSF Antarctic artist in residence to fly to newly opened leads at the edges, the margins of the Ross Ice Shelf, land a chopper, drill a hole to check the depth of the ice and make sure it was okay to turn the engines off, and quickly deploy coupled underwater and topside cameras at the edge of the ice to capture the orcas that were making a beeline in this newly opened lead to find ice fish that were now newly revealed that they hadn't previously had access to. Little did I expect to see, just a couple arms width away from me, spy-hopping orcas examining us as we were filming them. I flew to the dry valleys to catch up with ecologists testing the impacts, one of the very first experiments looking at the impacts of global warming on soil processes, biodiversity, and food webs, and to catch a glimpse with geologists of the very bizarre rock formations that are carved by winds in the dry valleys. After one boomerang flight to the South Pole, we finally made it, and marveled at the plans that were being made by physicists for the cubic kilometer array ice cube that would detect neutrinos, the importance of ozone hole measurements being done by atmospheric chemists, and the fortitude of the intrepid overwintering crews that support all of the amazing science conducted year-round. Back at McMurdo, we were treated to an invitation to visit New Zealand's Scott Base and learn about the close collaborations between our countries there. And just a few years ago now, I was lucky enough to visit King George Island on the opposite side of the continent to observe the productive multi-nation scientific collaborations underway there, including some very fun penguin work conducted by NOAA and academic scientists funded by NSF and NOAA. Although those close encounters are the mere tip of the iceberg of important research that's underway in the Antarctic, they gave me deep respect for the challenges and rewards of doing research in this unique place, an unforgiving environment, a place where you can do things that it's not possible anyplace else on the planet. Research that can't be done elsewhere, research that reveals secrets of the universe and helps us understand our place in it. Most people will never be so lucky as to travel to the Antarctic, but nevertheless, we're all connected to it. Antarctica is key to our scientific understanding, what it means to be on planet Earth. And we wouldn't be able to gain this knowledge without the vision for the region that was put in place by our predecessors in the middle of the Cold War, when 70 countries decided to come together under the umbrella of scientific cooperation to learn about our atmosphere, our cryosphere, ocean, and ecosystems. Against the backdrop of Sputnik and the space race, we managed to set aside 10% of the planet for peaceful purposes, mainly for research, with the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. This treaty allowed nations and researchers a stable and predictable mechanism to cooperate with each other and to look upward to the heavens, doing astronomical, cosmic, geophysical, atmospheric, climate, and environmental research that had never been done before, and that really couldn't be done anywhere else. The dry, clear polar air and the thinner ozone layer in the Antarctic's continent interior reduced atmospheric interference for optical and radio frequency telescopes. The convergence of Earth's magnetic field lines at the magnetic South Pole provides researchers opportunities to study the ionosphere, Van Allen radiation belts, geomagnetic phenomena, and solar activity. In addition, the absence of populated areas reduces light pollution, background noise, vibration, and electromagnetic interference for seismic stations, cosmic ray detectors, and high-energy particle instrument arrays. The remoteness of the interior also allows for safe deployment of equipment, like large-scale stratospheric weather balloons that have helped us understand the global climate system. In the decades since the treaty was first signed, this agreement has allowed us to appreciate the impact that the poles have on our global climate and our way of life. And now they are key to determining the kind of future we wish to have. What happens in the Antarctic doesn't stay in the Antarctic. The global interconnected ocean has the Antarctic circumpolar current as one of its main engines. This biogeographic barrier is what has driven unique evolutionary trajectory of Antarctic wildlife, and changes to the currents affect all cold water currents that run along the coasts of Africa, South America, and Australia. Those cold currents moderate the resulting climates of key population areas and the world's agricultural output. Ice core data from Antarctica provides up to 2.7 million years of paleoclimate data that helps scientists understand current and future climate dynamics. And importantly, polar ice sheet stability and glacial melt rates are essential to understand, given the 2 billion people worldwide who live in coastal areas and 680 million people living in low-lying coastal zones. According to NASA, Antarctica is losing around 146 billion metric tons of ice on average each year since 2002. And in the last 2 decades, Antarctica has lost 2.3 trillion metric tons of ice. This ice loss trajectory, when combined with Greenland's ice sheet loss in the rapidly melting Arctic, could lead to substantial risks to hundreds of millions of people globally. This cross-boundary threat of sea level rise and wholesale global system disruption makes understanding polar regions a high priority for countries wishing to understand and safeguard their economies, populations, coastal areas, and infrastructure in light of changes. And we've seen how localized changes threaten the endemic biodiversity of the continent. Record low sea ice levels will undoubtedly have knock-on effects for phytoplankton, for krill, and the marine life that rely on ice cover for the reproduction and life cycles, ultimately to feed the macrofauna we all love watching on our screens: whales, seals, penguins, and more. The warming of temperatures on the continent not only affects the glacial melt, but the kind of precipitation that falls. More rain instead of snow, which threatens penguins and seabird chicks whose downy feathers are not yet waterproof, leading to mass die-offs not seen until recent years. Antarctica's local weather systems are becoming more unpredictable for the species that have been specially adapted to and long dependent upon reliable access to either open ocean or sea ice at different seasonal stages in order to breed, eat, and survive. Changing wind patterns, warming temperatures, and human activities also threaten endemic biodiversity with invasive species introductions, invasive pathogens, and changes to the ecology of disease vectors like ticks. I'm sure that we'll hear from some brilliant scientists in the course of today and tomorrow who are at the forefront of this work, all of whom depend on the treaty's system's persistence and success. The United States has been a player from the start, hosting the signing of the treaty here in D.C. in 1959, and investing in research advances year after year, stretching well prior to the treaty years, but extending through our present at 3 year-round research stations, hosting the largest number of researchers each year. Considering some of the research advances we've produced from our scientific pursuits in the Antarctic, and that we continue to achieve every year thanks to the National Science Foundation's management of the U.S. Antarctic Program, and our international partnerships, our NOAA researchers and oceanographic vessels, and NASA's satellites. The continent has taught us about how changes in biodiversity and climate are changing everyone's future in countless ways. We've learned this through discoveries of hidden ecosystems, of ice fish nests on the seabed, plant fossils from millions of years ago, microbes unknown to science, records of geological and atmospheric change through mile-long ice cores, and now we are carefully unraveling information about unexpected pace of ocean warming, melting glaciers in West Antarctica, threatening a major global tipping point for climate change. So going forward, our ability to do this research is vital, and it relies upon a strong treaty system that is not just a nod to historic values, but is effective in practice. That's why President Biden, in the most recent national security strategy, reaffirmed our strong commitment to the Antarctic Treaty System, specifically to, quote, Antarctica's status as a continent reserved for peace and science, unquote. That is a commitment we take with us across all sectors of government and in partnership with our citizens, committing to preserve Antarctica as a global cornerstone for continued scientific learning in a peaceful and deeply important setting. Research doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires resources, infrastructure, innovation, energy storage, cold-tolerant instruments, and building design. It requires exceptional people and the resilience to adapt to challenging field conditions, and in recent years, pandemic constraints. Our science requires logistics with the help of our U.S. Air Force and Air National Guard's cargo and ice plane pilots and maintainers, Navy oceanographers, and Coast Guard icebreaker crews, all making research and resupply possible. And that science and the scientists behind it have taught us the need for the strongest possible commitment to protect the marine and terrestrial environment and its unique ecosystems, as envisioned in the treaty's environmental protocol. We rely upon our diplomats to consistently ensure that the best available science is used in every treaty meeting to protect endemic fauna, to establish Antarctic specially managed areas, Antarctic specially protected areas, important bird areas, and more. And at CAMLR, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, to use our oceanographic and fisheries data to make informed management and conservation decisions. This also includes taking steps in the Antarctic region to effectively protect vulnerable areas and species, such as meeting the 30 by 30 pledge to conserve 30% of our ocean by 2030. Obtaining consensus to approve the 3 U.S.-backed proposed marine protected areas in the Antarctic region would be a vitally important step forward. Furthermore, we rely on our inspectors to ensure that the success of the Antarctic Treaty as the world's first arms control treaty continues unbroken, and that its key provisions, like the general prohibition on mining, remain inviolate. We rely on citizens in the global community to act, to reduce carbon emissions, and continue tackling the climate crisis at home and every corner of the planet. Antarctica has shown us that we can come together and peacefully pursue research. Our challenge now is to take what we've learned from this global treasure and put it into action. The United States is fortifying our resolve to preserve Antarctica and its surrounding waters, to address, mitigate, and manage a shifting climate, so we become more resilient, and to ensure the continuity of the treaty system for everyone in the midst of global change. This is a great responsibility that we all share, regardless of nationality, and it's the great privilege of those who work to safeguard this last global wilderness that we all depend upon. I've portrayed a broad picture of some of the challenges ahead of us, and I'm very excited to see in the program many deeper dives in each of these different aspects. My thanks to the Wilson Center for organizing us and really shining a spotlight very appropriately and at a very important time on the Antarctic Treaty and the way forward. I thank everyone for this opportunity and for the engaging conversations today and the work that lies ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lubchenco, for those beautiful remarks. I have not yet made it to Antarctica, personally, which is a failure on my part. But I felt like I was there, and I appreciate those comments. I'm now delighted to introduce our next speaker, Professor Cassandra Brooks from the University of Colorado Boulder. She's an Antarctic expert whose research focuses on the social and ecological factors behind marine conservation. Please welcome Dr. Brooks.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a great honor, really great honor to follow Dr. Lubchenco, one of my professional heroes, and thanks again to the Wilson Center. So, of course, we need to start by talking about Antarctica, but what I want to share with you is that before we even knew the continent existed, before we had even discovered it, the ancient Greeks insisted that a great southern land must exist, in symmetry with the land in the north. Without it, they said, the entire world would topple over. And in fact, it was this idea of a great southern land which first drove nations to seek out and potentially exploit its riches. I want to draw your attention to this map behind me from 1565, imagining what Antarctica looked like. This so-called great southern land was believed to be more bountiful than the Americas. And I want you to look at this map for a second and look at the animals on it. Maybe you're seeing there's a unicorn here in the corner of the map, along with rhinos and lions. And again, this idea that there was this great southern land balancing the world and full of resource riches. But of course, by 1770, this is what a map of the world looked like, where we knew nothing really of Antarctica. It was this big empty hole in the map, and explorers going to try to find it, seeking out to find it, including for its, again, potential riches. Among those explorers was Captain Cook, who was instructed by Great Britain to find this great southern land and potentially exploit its riches. And in 1773, he was the first to cross the Antarctic Circle. But he didn't find the continent and instead noted, and I'll read his quote here, that the world would not be benefited by discovering the continent. Future explorers seeking to discover Antarctica would have to confront the unexpressible, horrid aspect of the country, a country doomed by nature, never once to feel the warmth of the sun rays, to lie ever buried under everlasting snow and ice. But the resource bounty Cook did find was the bounties of seals and whales, which were exploited throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, actually harvested to the brink of extinction. And amidst this harvest, explorers continued to come to Antarctica, planting their flags and staking claims. And the three global powers at the time, the USSR, United States, and Great Britain, all contest that they were the first to actually discover the continent. After discovering the continent came the race to plant a flag at the South Pole, and the famous story of Roald Amundsen from Norway using skis and dog sleds, moving quickly to actually be the first to plant a flag at the South Pole. And then, of course, at the same time, Robert Scott of Great Britain was also en route, landing there over a month later, actually, only to find that his team had been beaten by the Norwegians. And many of you probably know on Scott's return voyage home, they all perished, his whole team. And one of his last journal entries actually reads, "Great God, this is an awful place." After the South Pole came the quest to be the first to cross the entire Antarctic continent, which Ernest Shackleton set out to do in 1914. In his recruitment ad, he supposedly said, you can see it behind me, men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, but honor and recognition in case of success. So his team set out, and of course they didn't know how icy the Weddell Sea actually is, as we know now, and his ship was trapped and drifted for 8 months, where the men actually lived on the ship drifting in the ice. It eventually got crushed as the dogs watched in horror. And then they had to move to camp on the ice for another 6 months until the ice began to break up, and they had to take their tiny lifeboats, 20-foot-long wooden lifeboats, and travel to Elephant Island. In the most incredible leg of the journey, Shackleton and a small team actually took, again, these tiny 20-foot wooden lifeboats across the Drake Passage, 800 miles across the Drake Passage, to get to Elephant Island, where they were able to eventually find a whaling camp and get rescue for their whole team. So in total, Shackleton's team spent 22 months on the ice. So the reason we kept sending explorers to, in their own words, this barren, desolate, and awful place had a lot to do with, over the course of this exploring, planting flags and staking claims. So this is a map of Antarctica in 1942 showing you that by then, countries had divided Antarctica up like a pie, each staking claim. 7 different countries had claims in the region, including 3 overlapping claims in the Antarctic Peninsula region, and that was with Chile, Argentina, and Great Britain. And the U.S. and the USSR reserved their right to claim the whole thing. So we have these 9 countries, all with competing claims in Antarctica. And the tensions over claims were at times very extreme, especially in those Antarctic Peninsula regions where the claims were overlapping. And there were reports in the 1940s and 50s of military action, including this news article you're seeing behind me, this famed case of Argentina firing shots at Great Britain in Hope Bay. But 1946 was probably the biggest military show in Antarctica, coming shortly after World War II, where the United States Navy executed Operation High Jump, where they sent thousands of men and dozens of aircraft and vessels to the icy south. And among the goals of the expedition was to set up bases, but also to train men to fight in these Arctic-like conditions in case we had to wage war in the north with Russia. As the Cold War and the arms race between these countries continued, we had the satellite races, where the USSR won by a long shot, launching 2 large satellites before we got our first off the ground. But as we already heard a bit about, like in the midst of this tension, science provided unity. And all of those historic expeditions actually included science and scientists who were making discoveries and helping to shape national identities. Even in Shackleton's horrific expedition, even as the men's last link to the rest of the world, as their ship was being crushed before them, they were out on the ice actually gathering fish and zooplankton, dragging nets. They were continuing to make scientific discoveries. And science has just always been so core to our relationship to Antarctica. And I want to highlight the international polar years in particular. So 1882-83 saw our first international polar year, which was a collaborative, intensive international effort focused on the poles. The second came in 1932-33. And as we heard about, the third was this International Geophysical Year, which was set in 57-58, again at the height of the Cold War. And the International Geophysical Year, or IGY, set up this amazing framework for scientific collaboration. It included freedom of science, and this meant that scientists could actually operate in areas that were claimed by other countries. New bases were built. Science and personnel were shared, infrastructure was shared, administration was shared, and that meant communications, weather, and rescue. So effectively, for the sake of science, it was set up that those claims would be functionally suspended. And this was really important because after the 1932 International Polar Year, data was lost because of the oncoming of World War II. And so those involved in planning the IGY felt that without the free exchange of data and science, it would be pointless to even have an International Geophysical Year, that was incredibly important. So scientists timed the IGY to coincide with this peak sunspot activity and called for atmospheric satellites to measure that. So we needed new stations to launch those satellites, including one at the South Pole. The United States was really the country that had the technology and logistical capacity to build a station there. And of course, this came with the prestige of having a station at the intersection of all those claims. And so the Amundsen Scott station was built. Now, while the IGY called for these atmospheric satellites to measure solar activity utilizing this new technology that we had of satellites at the time, the technology to launch satellites, in many people's minds, was linked with the technology to launch missiles. And so this call of launching atmospheric satellites from Antarctica, to some, felt akin to this call of launching missiles from Antarctica. And so the world is watching as rumors are circulating that nuclear war could be waged from the southern continent. And this quote from the New York Times sums up the sentiment really well from 1959. It is in our interest to ensure that this vast region should never be turned by the Russians into a kind of Antarctic Albania, where launching pads could be used by the USSR to blackmail the entire southern hemisphere from here. But incredibly, based on that unprecedented unifying scientific collaboration of the International Geophysical Year and this incredible crisis at hand, instead of waging war in Antarctica, we moved towards a peace treaty. And the original signatories were the 12 countries who were involved in the IGY in Antarctica, who all had science bases there, and this included all of those claimant states. And as we heard here in Washington, President Eisenhower convened a conference in which the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. It was immediately celebrated as an international breakthrough, advancing the cause of world peace. And the Antarctic Treaty, this is from the preamble, recognizes that it is in the interest of all mankind that Antarctica shall continue forever, as Dr. Lubchenco noted, to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes and shall not become the scene or object of international discord. It is our first post-World War II arms limitation agreement. It does ban military activity. It is one of our largest nuclear-free zones in the world, as, again, it bans nuclear activity as well. It suspended those sovereignty claims and granted freedom of science. Later agreements under the treaty system ban mining and designate Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. Today, the Antarctic Treaty has 56 signatories, and new powers like China, who's among the most vocal parties in the Antarctic Treaty System in recent years. And the treaty is part of this larger regime of the Antarctic Treaty System, which includes the Protocol on Environmental Protection, the SEALS Convention, and the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR. And this system collectively governs the waters and the seafloor and the continent of Antarctica. And collectively, the system is dedicated to peace, science, and environmental protection. And all of these agreements are in place indefinitely. And I can't emphasize how amazing this agreement is. It truly is, I think, one of humanity's most marvelous achievements. We haven't done anything like this anywhere else, where we effectively set aside differences for the greater good. But as we already heard about, and we're going to hear a lot more about in this meeting, there's these new pressures in Antarctica. Antarctic ecosystems are undergoing tremendous change due to the pressures of climate change. And there's a lot on this graphic, but just to summarize for you, we have warming air temperatures, increases in precipitation and wind. The waters are warming, with freshening, acidification, and deoxygenation predicted. Sea ice is changing dramatically, with ice shelves thinning, retreating, and disintegrating. Ice sheets are losing mass. Because of all these changes in ice, we have increases in sea level. And for life on land, this means shifts in where life can grow and this big risk of invasive species. And for marine life, all of which is so superbly adapted to the freezing waters of the Southern Ocean, we're seeing contraction of Antarctic krill, potential declines in krill and fish, along with population changes and declines for mammals and birds. And I want to highlight in particular this potential extinction risk for emperor penguins. We've never had a species go extinct in Antarctica, and it's really wild that the first one that might is actually among our most iconic ones. And you may have seen the study that came out just last month showing widespread breeding failure of emperor penguins, showing that we don't actually have a lot of time left to safeguard this species. We also have the threat of increasing tourism. More than 100,000 tourists went to Antarctica in the last season, with 117,000 predicted for this next season. And you can see that rapid increase in tourism over the last few years. Bird flu actually raced through South America last fall, with Peru and Chile alone reporting more than 500,000 dead seabirds. So huge risk for Antarctic wildlife, and it's only a matter of time before bird flu gets there. We have pollution finding its way south, with the first evidence of microplastics found in Antarctic snow published just last year. And fishing is increasing in the Southern Ocean, and it's increasingly concentrated in coastal areas, potentially competing with foraging penguins and whales. So parties to the treaty system have been working to manage these threats to some degree, adopting measures that actually try to manage for invasive species and tourism and fishing and even climate change. Protected areas are a really powerful tool in terms of reducing other stressors so that life has the best chance of adapting to climate change. And we have been adopting protected areas on land, although right now they're considered too small to be adequate to actually protect biodiversity. The treaty also has the power to protect species, and the emperor penguin has been discussed for the last couple years. There's a proposal on the table to protect them. It hasn't been adopted yet by the Antarctic Treaty parties. But we have, of course, here in the United States, actually listed emperor penguins under the Endangered Species Act. Oops, sorry. There we go. Sorry. CAMLAR, which manages the waters around Antarctica, is also developing a system of protected areas, which we heard a bit about. I want to highlight, though, one core objective of many of these protected areas is to provide climate refugia, so to actually protect areas that might stay colder that can serve as a refuge for Antarctic life. CAMLAR has adopted 2 marine protected areas, including the world's largest marine protected area in the Ross Sea, with additional proposals under negotiation. But the fact is, and this was noted by the IPCC's special report on the oceans and cryosphere, published in 2019, is that all people on Earth depend directly or indirectly on the ocean and cryosphere. And all these changes that I'm talking about don't just mean trouble for Antarctica, it means trouble for all of us. And this is where that metaphor from the Greeks of this great southern land really comes into play for me, where without it, the world would topple over. Because the Greeks were right. We now know that Antarctica, rightly placed at the center of the map, is critical to the functioning of Earth's systems. It stores the majority of the world's fresh water, regulating sea level. It drives global ocean circulation, as we heard about, and as you can see on this figure behind me. And it actually regulates our climate. The Southern Ocean has stored a disproportionate amount of carbon and heat, essentially buffering the impacts of climate change for the rest of us. And as Dr. Lubchenco said so well, what happens in Antarctica does not stay in Antarctica. This is a picture from where I live in Boulder, Colorado, of one of the worst fires we ever had in the history of the state. The changes that are happening in Antarctica, in that great southern land, are contributing to these extreme climate and weather events globally, including droughts and wildfires and floods. Our crisis of today is not of countries waging war in Antarctica, but the global consequences of climate change. But it's not hopeless. Crisis can lead to breakthroughs, as we heard with the Antarctic Treaty. And while the IPCC reports call for urgent climate action, they do suggest that with immediate reductions in greenhouse gases, we can secure a livable future. And I hope I've made it clear that Antarctica is core to that future. For more than 15 years, the Antarctic has been this beacon of hope, serving as a model for international peace and science. And Antarctica can be our common ground for committing to global greenhouse gas reductions. And that's the only way to safeguard this great southern land. And by safeguarding Antarctica, we actually provide a future for ourselves and our children. So thank you so much. I'm so looking forward to the rest of the conversations here.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks, for that terrific lecture. I learned so much. I am delighted now to introduce our first panel on geopolitics and competitors in Antarctica. We are fortunate to have Professor Anne-Marie Brady, Professor Klaus Dodds, Professor Ningye Liu, and the Wilson Center Senior Fellow Evan Bloom. This panel will be chaired by Matthew Bouleg, Wilson Center Global Fellow. I would ask the panel to join us on stage now. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. it's quite unique to have so many people in front of me to discuss the Antarctic for 2 days. So congratulations! I think it's a huge accomplishment from the Wilson Center to be discussing that over the course of 2 days with so many policy people and experts, to hear from so many perspectives. So that's wonderful, and I don't think there's a better way to kick off this conversation than to discuss geopolitics, right? To try to do a sort of geopolitics 101 on what do we mean by geopolitics in the region. Because just like in the Arctic, in a way, the Antarctic, whether it's the continent or the Southern Ocean, are sort of no longer insulated from geopolitical tension, from the sort of spillover of mistrust in the international community, whether it is between Russia, China, and the United States and wider players in the region. Yet, let's not be catastrophic about it. The Antarctic Treaty System is not about to crumble. We're not going to have a complete destruction of the Antarctic Treaty System. Let's keep a cool head on that. Yes, of course, we have contenders and competitors. We know that China is up to no good in terms of potentially changing the governance facts. We know Russia is also potentially up to no good when it comes to dual-use technology and suspected military intelligence gathering and so on. But I think it's also important to deal with a sense of urgency about the future of the Antarctic, but not be completely catastrophic about it. So try to keep a cool head and try to keep policy where it should be. So the aim of this session is really for us to sort of raise awareness on current geopolitics. What do we mean by geopolitical trends in the region? As well as what are the future risks in terms of instability to the whole Antarctic Treaty System that must be safeguarded so that we can protect the Arctic. It's paramount to understand the moving nature of these geopolitics in terms of Russia-China individually and together, potentially reshuffling the cards of good governance, of consensus-based order and decisions, the risk of militarization potentially of the region, or at least the exploitation of dual-use technology that would go beyond the treaty, but also the future trends. So I aim this session to be a conversation between experts, sort of ping-pong back and forth discussion on all these things. And maybe to get us started, Evan, if I can turn to you first, I think we'll do a sort of gathering of statements for that first question. What do we mean by geopolitics in Antarctica? What does that evoke to you in a few words?
So Matthew, thank you. Good morning. It's great to be with you and this wonderful panel here. And as I look out on the sea of faces with so many extraordinary experts on Antarctica, it's just wonderful that we're able to have this event today. So geopolitics at least has something to do with how nation states have relations in relation to the southern continent. So since the Antarctic Treaty, we have the original 12 signatories, but we have so many other countries that have political and other interests in Antarctica. We have great power politics that plays out in Antarctica, but it's not just those kind of countries like Russia and China and the U.S., but the claimant states, which have major influence over Antarctic affairs, and the byplay that occurs in the two major diplomatic fora, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources and the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, and many people who work in those fora are here today. So those states coming together is what I think of as at the core of the geopolitics.
Thank you very much, Evan. Anne-Marie, over to you.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Warm Pacific greetings, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm really very excited that this event is being held. In 2014, I asked the Wilson Centre to consider creating an institute such as the Polar Institute, because I could see from my research that I was writing while I was a fellow at the Wilson Centre, this book that's published by the Wilson Centre, China as a Polar Great Power, that US foreign policy on Antarctica was not keeping up to date with what I called in another book, The Emerging Politics of Antarctica. And I got interested in looking and very concerned about what I found on Antarctic politics from looking at China from 2008, but also looking at Russia and Korea and studies I did with other partners. And it led me actually to launch a journal, the Polar Journal. I'm going to leave copies out there in the front, which tries to, what I found in my research was that, as we heard from what Cassandra was saying, this emphasis on science, the peaceful use of Antarctica, there's a very different dialogue going on in some countries between what you would find at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. And so what I have been doing for a number of years is trying to bring politics into the conversation. As a political scientist, one of the core questions in my field is about power. Who's got it? Who wants it? How do you get access to it? And so I brought that lens to looking at Antarctica. And I have to say, initially when I raised these questions, even though evidence-based, 10 years of research on this, the pushback I got from some US officialdom was pretty strong. You know, I was being called an alarmist a few years ago. But I notice now that senior US military officials are talking about Antarctica and talking about security in Antarctica, but not necessarily in a well-informed way. I've heard US officials talking about the Antarctic Treaty ending in 2048, for example, which you also find as a common false narrative in Chinese language sources. So one of the politics that I really wanted to emphasize in the research that I've been doing is that we need to understand comparative Antarctic foreign policies, that we need to know that the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings and other Antarctic Treaty meetings are polite affairs where controversial issues are not raised, but we need to pay attention to the discussions in different languages of our Antarctic Treaty states and understand how they look at Antarctica. And for China and Russia, the priorities are security, resources, and strategic science. And what I have found is there's a particularly noticeable in recent years a very different narrative from the one that became prevalent in the early 1990s with the passing of the Environmental Protocol in Antarctica, passing and the ratifying in 98, this idea of Antarctica as a wilderness. And, you know, in my country, New Zealand was being very invested in that idea. And I know that many people believed in that and actually felt that that meant that that was the end of politics in Antarctica with that protocol. But the geopolitics was always there. The third island chain which is a metaphorical island chain, goes from the Aleutians down to New Zealand all the way down to Antarctica. And in my other research on China's global foreign policy, I know that China is very interested, as the Soviet Union was, about undermining the strategic order and what we now call the Indo-Pacific and the hub-and-spoke series of agreements that the US set up in the beginning of the 1950s, which were aimed at containing communism. So the politics have always been there. They were there at the IGY, where the US explicitly excluded Red China. They were there. They've been there in the last 2 years with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They've come up at ATCM meetings. They were there at the Ross Sea MPA when John Kerry negotiated a non-ideal agreement with Russia. Not what the scientists wanted for the Ross Sea MPA wanted a lasting agreement. The politics are there, and I really believe that this is something that there's a balance between this lovely idealism of the Antarctic Treaty System and then the realities of what different partners have and bring to Antarctica and how they look at Antarctica. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anne-Marie. So, completely agree, geopolitics have been there, they are here in a way. And Klaus, if I can continue that sort of thread on it, what are the wider risks in a way of geopolitics being or taking hostage discussions when it comes to the future of the Antarctic Treaty System with all these great players? We'll touch upon Russia and China more specifically a bit later. I'm thinking about the sort of consequences of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Do we have a sort of similar pattern that we see in the Arctic with the complete absence of cooperation now, for instance, with regards Russian actions. Do you foresee a sort of spillover, a wider spillover of geopolitics in the region?
Well, good morning, and again, thank you very much for the invitation to be with you. So I would probably stress 3 or 4 things. I think, first of all, it's really important to bear in mind that the Antarctic Treaty and the Antarctic Treaty system, for all its great merit, is in essence a consensual system. In other words, that we're only able to achieve what we're able to achieve if we can agree with one another. And whether we like it or not, consensus and all its glories can also, unfortunately, lead to the lowest common denominator making itself felt. It's worth saying that in the 1950s, consensus had a very different connotation. It would have been seen as the apex of diplomatic achievement. It would not have been seen, as it so often is nowadays, as a pejorative term. I think the second thing to say is the Antarctic Treaty system has always had to manage spillover. So the idea that people negotiating and operating the system, if you will, in the 50s and 60s and 70s were thinking that they were in splendid isolation, I think is misplaced. And that made itself felt very, very clearly when the Antarctic became a subject of regular debate within the United Nations General Assembly. So it's just to give you a sort of, in a sense, a background there to say that some of this is not new. And I think that's really important because there's always a danger, a little bit of presentism, and everyone thinks, goodness me, there must be spillover because of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine from February 22 onwards. There always has been spillover. The greatest crisis the Antarctic Treaty System has ever faced, in my opinion, was in the late 1980s when we had the crisis over whether we would develop or not a minerals convention. It led to the environmental protocol, and we, I thought, explicitly said under Article 7, mining was permanently banned. Now, to come to what I think you're getting at, Mathieu, is that I think there is growing evidence, however, that the rules, norms, and values associated with the Antarctic Treaty System are being ever more explicitly challenged. And I think that's the point of concern. And let me just end on this final note as well. That broader picture is important. If we've learnt one thing, particularly from February 22 onwards, we've learnt that not everybody condemns the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, number one. Number two, Russia has taken, as it has done earlier, advantage or has been taken advantage of by third parties like China and India. Thirdly, we've seen the expansion of BRICS, and we will see BRICS becoming more active, initially in the Arctic, and I would predict in the Antarctic as well. And we need to be alive to the fact that the Antarctic Treaty has never been and will never be immune from broader global geopolitical currents. And what we're seeing at the moment, I think, is a kind of shadow war over things like marine protected areas, over protection for emperor penguins, and I think a watering down of some of the idealism that Cassandra talked about, importantly so, which was about science being this palliative presence. And I think what worries me is that actually the consensus that underpins the Antarctic Treaty System, which is really about norms and values actually as much as rules, is being weathered. I'll end on that point. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Klaus. It's interesting to see that science can be taken hostage in many ways, and we've seen it on the emperor penguins, for instance, and the way that some countries like Russia and China, we will talk about these contenders, are sort of collaborating or tag teaming to increase or force multiply when it comes to challenging the established order. So, Nenge, if I can turn on to you to sort of discuss the one of the first elephants in the room when it comes to China's presence in the region in terms of policy. Is China an Antarctic power, as Anne-Marie defined it, in terms of the power sought by countries to have access and potentially exploit instead of protecting the area? And what does it signify in terms of Antarctic governance?
Yes, thank you, Matthias. First, good morning to you all, and thank you very much, Wilson Center, for organizing this important conference at this new history junction, and bringing me here from Asia after 20 hours flight. And I hope I can bring you some fresh tropical air to the DC's autumn. So I actually would like to answer your first question first, Matthias, with a human face about what does geopolitics mean to me. You know, I grew up in Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin's China. So, you know, that was the time after the Cold War, the US finally, or let's say the liberal world finally won, right? The history ends. The neoliberalized globalization dominates the whole world, and China embraced the Western, the US-anchored Western system, and then pretty much looked like the history is there. So I mean, for me, that was the time when I grew up in China, and then that's the time when I went to Europe and had a good education of my PhD there, and then I moved to Australia and teach in Australia for 7 years until this point of history. I'm now in Singapore, and you know, it's a personal story, but I also see this as what geopolitics really mean to me, because when I was in Australia, that was between 2015 to 2022. That was exactly the time when the time flips. You know, in 2015, the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement entered into force. So there was a hype that China was the future, and everyone went to China. And in just really about 5 years, China became the largest enemy and the security threat to Australia, and not just Australia, right? So now we see this story happening in New Zealand, in South Korea, in Japan, in Singapore as well. So, you know, the thing is, and I, as an academic with a root in that part of the world, so I ask it myself every day, because, you know, you're sort of confronted with a news piece from Sydney Morning Herald or from, you know, New York Times all the time. So it's kind of like becomes a bit of a hazard in my mental space. Like, what does that mean? And eventually I realized it actually means some kind of geopolitical tension. It actually means to cut off the connections. See, when we have globalization, when we have a world when the freedom of the flow of the people, trade, and commodities are the mainstream. Of course, racism, security, national security is always there. But when these are the mainstream, people can freely move to a different part of the world, exchange ideas, you know, and also do trade. But then when we have the geopolitics these days, it's actually where the connections are, and meaningful and substantial connections are being cut. So the world is divided into camps, and the different camps, they have different standards, and then they will have minimum contact between each other. That happened in the Cold War in Antarctica. We had the Antarctic Treaty, and that is happening again in these days. So I think that's what I would like to say as my opening statement.
And what about China? Is China an Antarctic power?
Oh, absolutely.
Throwing back the question.
And how do you define it? I mean, we are now entering into a new era. As no doubt, I mean, the U.S.-China competition is, I think, even Chinese media is not shy about saying that, you know, because that's the reality, and that's indeed the elephant in the room. And China is now building the Ross Sea new station on the Ross Sea ice shelf, so that I think that was supposed to be completed in 2019 and 2022, and because of COVID, now it is planned to be completed in 2024. And once it's completed, China will have the same number of permanent research stations as the US. So I mean, I can keep talking about this, but I think the message to answer your question is very clear. Indeed, that is a new era. There is a power there in the system, but it's not the first time.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Anne-Marie, if I can revert the question in terms of power, what is China seeking in a way with that power and that presence in China, in Antarctica? Sorry.
Well, I would say that the demonstration of China as an Antarctic great power and as a polar great power, which is a different measure of when we look at if a state is a great power, there were the measures in the past were focused on, you know, technology that China actually has, like aircraft carriers. They do have some now, but China has looked at the the new strategic territories is what they've called it, and that's a phrase that Kennedy used actually in the early 60s, such as the high seas, the polar regions, outer space, cyber space, as new strategic territories that China could expand into and look to advantages. They have, in Antarctica, China has fully independent air, land, and sea capabilities. And China's, just looking at icebreakers and ice-capable vessels, China has better capacity than the US these days. And it's just really shocking to me to observe how slow the US is to respond to this. And, seeing the infrastructure issues that there are in the US in responding to this challenge to be able to protect its own interests. But also, of course, the US works with partners like New Zealand. We rely on the US to have great capacity in Antarctica in order to get to Antarctica, as do other Antarctic powers, states who work with the US. So China has the capacity and capabilities. It has had... when Xi Jinping came into power, the reason why the 5th Antarctic base is not yet built is because there was a hold. That base should have been built by 2018 on the original plan. There was a hold on the spend. But China has, for a long time, the Polar Research Institute in China the staff there told me it was like an open checkbook. They have had a lot of resources at hand, and China has put a lot of energy into understanding the rules around Arctic and Antarctic governance and the resources in the Arctic and Antarctic. So they are highly motivated and organised and well-resourced. So China is an Antarctic power, and like in other parts of the world, they're looking to, they'll work with the international system where it suits them, and then the other parts that they don't, well, they'll do things their own way. And you mentioned civil-military. Civil-military fusion is very much a feature of China's military modernization, using civil activities which actually have a military use. And this is a real danger in Antarctica. We talked about the we had in our first speaker talking about relying on the US, on the inspectors to maintain the rules in Antarctica and these wonderful rules. But what I found in this book was that China was doing a whole lot of military activities that it wasn't reporting. Now, it's not correct to say, as it was said earlier, that the Antarctic Treaty bans military activity. Military activity is permitted for peaceful purposes. But what are the peaceful purposes is in the eye of the beholder. And you can have a lot of military activity, or you can have facilities which can be useful for your global military interests. And that is what is happening with some of the infrastructure that China has in Antarctica. For example, like the Battelle global navigation system, like the GLONASS for Russia, and like GPS for the US. And that's why China and Russia, where they got the idea from. So there is another problem. Here's another elephant in the room, which is the US's strategic interests in Antarctica, which are apparent to other players. And, there's long been, as Klaus will know, this has been a narrative in Antarctic politics about hypocrisy and the gentleman's club. It's quite sad. I love the idealism of the scientists and the people who've been promoting the ideas of Antarctica. But when I read in the resources in Russia and Chinese or in Korean, for example, studies that I've done, I see different narratives. And we should be aware of those different narratives and perceptions about Antarctica, which are very different. And just one final point I'd like to say that the geopolitical crisis that we have globally And the Russia and China have explicitly challenged the rules-based international order. They say that it's just a Western international order, and that includes the Antarctic Treaty, that's as important as the climate change crisis, equally important. Because what we're seeing is Russia and China, and sadly, are being spoilers when their interests of their own people are affected, but they are not cooperating on things like climate change and environmental protection, for political reasons. So this is what we have to deal with and face up to. We need to be realistic about the situation, and how can you bring the beautiful principles of Antarctica, but to confront them with the realities of what is happening politically now.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. If I can turn to you, Evan, now to discuss the other elephant in the room in terms of Russia, and what no good is Russia up to in terms of challenging the ATS in general. We'll discuss dual use and militarization afterwards, but just in terms of...
So can I spend a minute on China?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
Moving from first to China, because we've been discussing that. So, is China a polar power? Is it an Antarctic power? The answer is certainly yes. And during my time working on these issues from a diplomatic point of view, 20 plus years ago, China wasn't present very much in Antarctica. It was rather silent at treaty meetings. It wasn't even a full member of CAMLR, but it has transformed itself through doctrine, through investment, to being a much larger player and willing, like Russia, to speak out in fora and not just sit back. At the same time, I think one has to set this in context, because there are many powers in Antarctica. There's US, there's Russia, there's Australia, there's UK, there's Argentina. There are countries that have presence and influence that I think count. And it's not as if China has somehow leapfrogged everybody. Indeed, when you look at the actual presence, not just the number of stations, because if you did it that way, then I think Argentina is the most powerful country in Antarctica. You have to look at how many people, their logistics capabilities, and other factors. When you look at that, the U.S. is still the largest and most influential country in those terms, and China's presence is more modest. But turning to Russia, so Russia has a large number of stations. They have been placed strategically over the past decades in lots of different areas. One could say that they're trying to establish themselves in lots of different territorial parts of the continent to make a statement that way. But they tend to kind of fight below their weight. Their stations tend to be under-resourced, and so that their presence doesn't seem to be rising in terms of investment. And when you look at how these countries behave in the diplomatic fora, then you get a sense of what their attitude is towards Antarctic policy. So the Russians at CAMLR proved to be extremely difficult in terms of working with them on scientific issues, on the marine protected areas, on just sort of general working together on fisheries, even though in the end, usually you get results out of CAMLR at the end in terms of coming up with fishing quotas. The Chinese similarly are present. They have done they've taken rather inexplicable positions when it comes to emperor penguins at the Antarctic Treaty meetings, but they're not troublesome on every issue. And at CAMLR, well, there are differences of view on compliance issues, on transshipment, on the marine protected areas in particular. But of course, in 2016, both Russia and China agreed to the Ross Sea MPA. So it's kind of a mixed bag of things when it comes to their participation.
Thanks a lot, Evan. Another good point that was made and already touched upon is this risk of these geopolitical contenders, specifically Russia and China, conducting, with the use of dual-use technology, a form of militarization, or at least securitization of their activities in the region, specifically for intelligence gathering or military intelligence gathering, suspected use of the ground-based space assets, for instance, or as Anne-Marie mentioned, the satellite navigation systems, but also electronic warfare capabilities, missile tracking, and so on. Klaus, a question to you to open on that. Do we have the tools necessary to actually fight that peaceful, not so peaceful presence, right? It's not just about militarization, it's about peaceful presence and how by the flick of a button you conduct, ocean science that turns into military intelligence. Do we have the tools to keep stability, to continue to uphold ATS regulations? And in a way, another question to sort of continue on that is, do we need to completely update or revamp the inspections regime? And what must be done about that?
Well, it was ever thus. Again, sorry if I sort of harp back to historical context, but for my sins, I spent many, many, many hours in the archives in various countries reading the original papers in 1957, 58, 59, which is helpful, including in the US, amongst other countries. I think the Antarctic Treaty is all about trade-offs, and the Antarctic Treaty system continues in that vein. Science and geopolitics have dual use, and I say this as a British citizen. The British in particular have been and continue to be past masters and present masters at dual use and at putting science to work for geopolitical purposes and geopolitics to work for scientific purposes. We had to. As Cassandra mentioned and showed us in the map, our reality is a grim one. We have overlapping claims with third parties, Argentina and Chile, and at least one doesn't really like us at the best of times. Worse still, we have, as you know, live disputes with that third party that doesn't care for us at the best of times, with a couple other islands that continue to trouble us, namely the Falklands, Malvinas, and of course South Georgia. And then to compound our particular misery, we also occasionally have diplomatic spats with our closest ally by accident, because we can't always get along with the Russians, who don't mean us well when it comes to things like fishery negotiations around South Georgia. And Evan has reflected on that. We had a little unfortunate breakdown in the entente cordiale, at least with the United States. So we find ourselves in a really very, very awkward position. We were hugely enthusiastic when the Antarctic Treaty was negotiated in December 1959, and Cassandra could have mentioned, if she'd wished to, that we were the earliest to ratify the Antarctic Treaty. There are not many things, by the way, we come first in Antarctic matters, but that was, sorry, just an aside, really, because we usually are second at best. Now, why, by the way, why did we ratify it with such enthusiasm? Because we thought this was the answer to all our troubles. If we could continue to be scientific stars, then actually science would protect us. That in the end, our territorial claims, our long-standing inadequacies, and our fears that the United States and the Soviet Union were going to overwhelm us could all be held at bay by this wonderful thing called the Antarctic Treaty. So, dual use has been absolutely integral to the system throughout its history. The second thing is that infrastructure has always been a source of geopolitical rivalry and competition. Thirdly, information gathering and the exchange of knowledge has had to compete with the idealism of science, that there should be no borders or boundaries to information sharing, and the other reality, which is that information and knowledge gathering has always been highly sensitive in the Antarctic context. When Cassandra again talked about whaling and sealing, another issue to put into the mix is that whalers and sealers didn't want to share information about whales where whales and seals were, because it was commercially sensitive. that's not really gone away. So we can talk about satellite systems, GPS. It's not new in its own right. There's always been that anxiety. The final thing I just want to also reinforce is please don't underestimate the extraordinary prestige and investment that some countries have in the Antarctic Treaty System, and Russia and China know that. They know that the UK, the US, Norway, and others care deeply about the Antarctic Treaty System, including marine protected areas. That is both a source of strength to us, but it is also a source of weakness when others act in bad faith, and they do act in bad faith. And I think Evan, amongst others, has been absolutely the centre of the action of bad faith. Final thing just to say.
Oh, okay.
We have 4 official treaty languages.
Yeah.
It's just worth reminding everybody what they are: English, French, Spanish, and Russian. You know, so again, that's a legacy from the late 50s. We're in a very, very different world now. You know, when will we see China as an official treaty language discussed? Or Chinese, sorry.
Thanks a lot, Klaus. So before we open the floor to questions and the discussion with the audience, just maybe a sort of capping statement or famous last words, as you will, on the future of the Antarctic in terms of future risks for governance, future potential geopolitical hijacking by these bad faith actors, as we mentioned, by Russia and China, the future of the system in a way. What is at risk, right? And if we project it maybe in 30 years, I don't want to put too much emphasis on 2048. Once again, Mary mentioned it, the system will not crumble and the mining ban will just not disappear overnight in 2048. Urgency, but not catastrophism. And if I can do a sort of reverse order, Nengi, I'll start with you. Short sort of closing statements on that. In 30 years, where are we?
Yes, I
think there's a slide.
I have prepared one slide. Yes, and I have a lot to talk, but there is no time. Yes, I know everybody is.
Keep some for the Q&A.
Yes, yes. And not this one, the next one, just the next one. Thank you. So yeah, I can talk a lot, but my message to you all before you ask me questions, and so it is after coming here, after traveling 20 hours to here, is Antarctica is beautiful. The Antarctic Treaty System is beautiful. The United States of America is beautiful, because in Chinese we call America 美国, a beautiful country. So, how to appreciate beauty? In 1993, this very kind of guru of the Chinese sociologist, Fei Xiaotong. So he was trained in the 1930s in the London School of Economics, and then went back to China, went through the Cultural Revolution, horrible time, and then he survived. And so in 1993, he was talking about how to appreciate beauty to a group of young Chinese students. And he used these 16 words to talk about his principles. The first one is 各美其美. So every form of beauty has its uniqueness. 美人之美. Precious is to appreciate other forms of beauty with openness. 美美与共. If beauty represents itself with diversity and integrity. 天下大同. The world will be blessed with harmony and unity. So I will stop here. I will leave you to think about it after hearing all these alarmist and also idealistic words from my colleagues and panelists. And the thing is also, my final last word is, I teach this to my international law students in Australia and Singapore, is, one of the major driving forces of development of international law is a clash between idealism and realism. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nengi. So once again, urgency but not catastrophe. Klaus, if you will, thank you.
Yeah, so I think my quick takeaway would be is act as if the Antarctic Treaty and the system that it is underpinned by matters. Reinforce the point that rules, norms, and values all matter. You can't have one without the other two. And thirdly, I think we have to be comfortable with the idea, as is already implicitly happening, that we don't want consensus at all costs. So it's okay to disagree. and it's okay to be open about those disagreements and call out bad behavior. Do it now. Don't let's drift into the 2030s by not saying things that need to be said.
Thank you very much, Klaus. So I'll take that to Brussels. Don't take consensus at all costs. I think that they need to hear it as well, in the European Union. Anne-Marie?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that we need to bring security into the conversation about Antarctica. And there's people in the room here who, if they had permission to speak, could tell us a lot, could answer the questions that were asked about military intelligence gathering in Antarctica, the missile tracking, and so on. But the problem is to find the space when we can combine you need to talk about Antarctica, you need to have some scientists who can tell you about scientific capabilities and difficulties that you can have operating in Antarctica. You need people with language skills and knowledge of the comparative foreign policies of Antarctica, and you need people who understand the international complex laws that govern Antarctica, which are not just the Antarctic Treaty. There's a whole lot of international law more broadly that also governs Antarctica. So I think this conversation here today is a great start, but I think there need to be some closed-door, safe space conversations where partners with that diverging sect of capability of knowledge come together to face up to the challenges that there are in Antarctica, that there is very different visions, and there have been for a long time, but they're very prominent, becoming very prominent now. And I know that the Five Eyes partner states have been grappling with the issue of how to deal with this dual-use technology in Antarctica, because the finger will come pointing back to you as well. So this is an issue that I think it needs urgency, and it needs a free and frank conversation where you are allowed to talk about security in Antarctica, and then see what you can protect and what you need to do. So this is a conversation that needs to be had in another setup beyond today. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So a good way forward in terms of discussions. Evan, last but not least.
Okay, so geopolitics in Antarctica, there's a lot of it. There are all sorts of challenges to U.S. policy down there. There are concerns about the behavior of people who have different strategic interests from the U.S. At the same time, the Antarctic Treaty, historically and currently, delivers a lot for the international community and for the United States. So, in fact, there is demilitarization in general. You do not find armament in Antarctica. The claims situation is managed tolerably. By and large, there is sustainable fisheries management. There is, in fact, a legally binding mining ban that exists. It's not something that we have ambition to create. It, in fact, exists, and all countries speak in favor of it at the moment. Whether they will continue to act in accordance with it, and do they always now, is another sort of question. But in addition, the treaty creates a framework in which science is able to take place, and that is the key objective, as I understand it, of U.S. policy. So there are a lot of good things going on. There are also some serious challenges related to, for example, consensus based decision making, which, as has already been suggested, can lead to least common denominator results or no results at all. The inability to deliver on a network of marine protected areas in the past years, these problems of dual use that have been mentioned, the problem of blocking compliance and science activities through CAMLR. I mentioned the worries about Article 7, the mining ban and its longevity. these serious problems that related to South Georgia and fishing and Russia, U.S., U.K. kind of problems that could result in something much more serious, turn into very serious problems in the future, and impacts of tourism, which also have some questions here. So in any event, there are a lot of these issues out there, but fundamentally, at least from, I think, a U.S. interest point of view, the Antarctic Treaty provides a lot of benefits.
Thanks a lot, Evan. So yeah, a sort of growing list of things that should be managed better. So we have our list of homework. Let's get to work. Let's now open the floor to questions, comments. I have the first one here. Yes, please, sir.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your panel. Thank you.
Can you possibly introduce yourself as well and state your affiliation?
Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Good morning. My name's Tony Salinas. I'm an Army officer, and I'm currently doing my PhD at Georgetown in climate and security. So thanks for all those comments there. So thanks for your talks on geopolitics. And we heard a lot of conflicting interests, from different areas of the world. And to use the old diplomatic adage, you don't negotiate with your friends, right? You negotiate with your competitors. There's Arctic Council. Evaluate, should there be an Antarctic Council, right? We have the treaty, but is there a forum where powers can come together and hash out interests?
Interesting. Who wants to take it first? Before.
Well, I don't think the Arctic Council is a particularly good example of hashing out interests. It's also that's also a body where you get the outcomes of what can be agreed on, and there's whole big gaping areas of policy that just don't get dealt with because of lack of consensus. But people have talked about the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. Back in the 90s, one of our New Zealand diplomats was really tried to bring some more heft into the conversation by having a ministerial on the ice. Because one of the problems with the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings is that while the figures who attend are senior in each government's Antarctic policy making, they're not necessarily senior overall in the whole of the foreign ministry, and they don't have the power to be making decisions on the behalf of their countries. So if we wanted to confront some issues, you probably need higher level representation and are willing to raise difficult issues. But I think that this is something that what we're seeing now is has been seeing in recent years is these sort of these groupings of like-mindeds in Antarctica, and Five Eyes is I think is an unacknowledged like-minded within the Antarctic Treaty System, and that's probably going to be one effective way where countries that share common security concerns about the way in which Antarctica can be used for this global great game, and want to see how we can protect some of the things that Evan has been celebrating of what was good about the Antarctic Treaty System.
Thank you. Any other takers on that question?
Yeah, I could.
Yeah, please.
I think there are pros and cons. So the Arctic Council, they used to have the senior ministers meeting, and yes, it's easier to raise the profile of the meeting, but then it's also easier to be affected by the political situation. Like after the Ukraine war, then it's completely halted. Right now, they are resuming very limited cooperation with Russia. Well, in the Antarctica treaty system, it's the other way around. So it's more technical. So I would say at some point, because also you could say that the Antarctic treaty system is a well-designed house. I mean, it has the architecture is already there. So of course there used to be a bigger kind of a tenant, a Soviet Union, and then it collapsed. And now there is a rising tenant, so who ask for a bigger place. So, but the thing is, the good thing about the ATCM is like it's more technical. So actually, they are less swung by this political cloud. So, and I actually would like to raise my point here, following what Professor Brady just said. It is actually very devastating to have camps within the Antarctic Treaty System. That's kind of my observation, because I have also been there in the Kamala meeting, and I have seen when there are camps. And it's actually a danger that we should avoid. And when we are talking about science as a currency, when we are talking about this Antarctic treaty system, what we are trying to do is to avoid camps. Let's all just put away our difference. That sometimes are huge differences, like between Soviet Union and US in the Cold War, and now between China and US. Still, you can still work together and do something in the remote icy part. So when you have that kind of mentality in that space, I'm not talking about Five Eyes in the global stage. I'm talking about that particular context, the Antarctic context. When you have small camps, we have seen what's going on already. That these tense, sometimes very unnecessary tense debates between camps in Kamala meetings when it comes to MPA. But these are the self-fulfilling prophecy. When you talk about it all the time, that will end up like that. So that's kind of my point.
Thank you. Well, such is maybe the nature of international negotiation, that we fall back into camps. Klaus, did you want to add anything to that question?
I'm just keen to hear other questions, respectfully, if that's okay.
Next question then. Anybody, if you want to raise your hand, any comments in particular or challenges to what was discussed? No? Nothing? Nobody?
Otherwise, I will come back
Good.
to the Arctic Council if you want me to.
Sir, did you? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tom Dans. I'm a former U.S. Arctic Research Commissioner, and I'm working with Hudson Bay Capital now. We're working on icebreakers. And I guess a question to Dr. Bloom, but also for the others in the audience. To what extent is infrastructure going to lead in terms of determining how this game plays out from here? And particularly, what are you seeing in terms of maybe other countries who haven't been in the lead in Antarctica now using infrastructure to advance their position and posture?
Thank you very much. Very, very good question. Evan, you want to tackle this first, and I'll call on the panel as well.
Yeah, presence tends to be a proxy for something, being influence or something else. Because if you have more skin in the game, then you're paying more attention, you're creating more science, you're more involved. So traditionally, the U.S. has had that kind of presence, with the only station at the South Pole, the largest station, McMurdo, a station in the peninsula, Palmer Station. But other countries have been investing more. I will say that things have gotten scrambled, my sense of it, and there are folks here from the government who probably have a better sense of it than I do, which over the past few years with COVID hitting and then the longer term effects of upgrading stations and the delays involving getting the people there to do the construction and all that kind of thing. So I think we've had a kind of hiatus in building up of infrastructure for many countries, including the U.S. And yet I think that we see a trend of countries, including larger major countries, wanting to establish stations or upgrade those stations. I think the major objective of these countries, by and large, is the ability to participate in the scientific enterprise. It's not just to be there. But I mean, that can play into it too, depending upon the country and the situation. But I think the trend is for larger investment in infrastructure, including in terms of logistics and, the planes and ships that are needed to support those efforts.
Thank you very much, Evan. Klaus?
Yeah, so I think it's a really powerful question, because in the past we had bomber gaps, we had missile gaps, we probably have infrastructure gaps. I think in the US, there's often a debate, isn't there, about icebreakers, and we have icebreaker anxiety, and why don't we have an icebreaker that works? And goodness me, the Soviets, the Russians appear to have 40. How is that possible? Well, there's obviously an answer to that. Now, coming from Britain, again, you heard me talk about our little local problem in the Antarctic Peninsula region. It probably won't surprise you to know that we've invested quite a lot, actually, in the last decade in upgrading our polar infrastructure, and we do so for several reasons. First of all, because we want to show the world that we are still a great polar power, despite everything that has befallen on us. Secondly, we want to remind our near neighbours that we are serious. Thirdly, we want to honour our national treasure, Sir David Attenborough, which we did, naming our latest vessel after him. And fourthly, and there are folks in the audience here who can talk to this as well, we, like our important and close allies like Australia, do worry what others do with their infrastructure in terms of their reach and their capability. And I'll just end on this note in terms of an illustration of how we responded to opportunities. After the UK withdrew from Afghanistan, it was quite striking that our Royal Air Force, the RAF, became somewhat more involved in sort of supporting deep science operations with British Antarctic Survey, partly because the RAF had extra capacity post-Afghanistan, but partly, in all honesty, we were increasingly concerned that we had to have reach in British Antarctic territory. And one of the things you discover, we're quite good at this as well, by the way, this is a top tip for anybody who wants to extend their influence and reach. If you don't have infrastructure at hand, or you're a little bit short of money, which we often are, one thing we do have is naming. So in 2012, we took the very wise decision to name a vast area of Antarctic Peninsula Queen Elizabeth Land. So
Argentina like that.
Argentina was hugely enthusiastic about that. So was Chile. But we did issue some postage stamps.
Good soft power.
Different kind of infrastructure. Postage
good soft
stamps.
power,
Don't
absolutely.
underestimate it.
Yeah, well, China's named a lot of things too, actually.
Yeah, Bulgaria has
so there's Cassandra showed us the map of the claimant states, and New Zealand's a claimant state. So one of the things that I found, I can't show it on the board here, on the screen, but you can find it in the book, is there's a triangle in Antarctica that China, humorously, I think, in the IPY, they were calling it Panda. It's in the Australian territory. The Australians were very alarmed. It's from their base on the coast going up into Dome A, where China is claiming the world's biggest Antarctic special managed area, where they're the only country operating. And this is I remember when I first heard about the fist stumping at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings, when China's pretty fed up about not getting that ASMA passed, because they see environmental protection in the internal narrative as a kind of containment measure, enclosure measure, as does Russia. China has named practically every rock, it seems, in that triangular area in what is within the 42% Australian Antarctic claim. And in their internal documents, they reserve the right to claim territory in Antarctica. And, of course, the international law people have a fit at that. China has got some different ideas about things in Antarctica, and this is a problem that has to be acknowledged, and that won't come up in the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meeting. So infrastructure in Antarctica is definitely, strategic infrastructure is something that China has really been focused on, and it's a lot more than personnel. It's really interesting even that you mentioned the large number of US scientists and other personnel in Antarctica. See, China operates the Dome A base they don't even get there. Usually every 2 years they send an expedition up there, but they maintain their occupation of that territory through all these instruments, which relaying the information that they require, or they've had these sort of containers set up in what is going to be eventually the 5th Antarctic base. They've had them, they put them in place there some years ago. So it's like that kids game where we used to play when I was in New Zealand. I dabs that, you put your hand on it and it's yours, and then no one else can go there. But with the technology now, also countries can have control and access and usage of important places in Antarctica, important in terms of deep space research, for example, in domain. So it really is an issue, and that comes back to priorities. New Zealand and Australia have both in recent years, even though it's very modest by global terms, have increased the capability, have put money into planes and vessels that would be ice capable and be able to operate in Antarctica. And that's our way. It was also said today that countries can't exercise sovereignty, that no one exercises sovereignty in Antarctica. I tell you, as a claimant, someone from a claimant state, that New Zealand doesn't think that we can't operate sovereignty, and that's a question that's constantly coming up in discussions, internal discussions in New Zealand. And one of the ways we can exercise sovereignty is by using our military forces, for example, in the illegal fishing operations that our patrolling that our New Zealand Navy boats do. Countries can, like the US, need to, if they want to protect their interests, one of the ways in which they can do so is to modernise and update their infrastructure. But is there the budget for it? What we say, we're going to might have a furlough next week in the US again, and this is nobody can fix this easily, but this is a challenge, isn't it? In each country, can our governments, while recognising the challenge, can they do anything about it?
Thanks a lot, Anne-Marie. And on Russia's side, Klaus, you'll probably be happy to remember that Russia also had their sort of postal stampage epiphany in 2020 with the Hurtigruten Expedition and claiming that the Antarctica is theirs and so on, to sort of great patriotic ecstasy, and putting extra budget in 2020
postage stamps.
For yeah, absolutely. So the budget went the budget went down to corruption probably for a huge part, and then for the war in Ukraine. So Antarctic is definitely not a priority, and maybe something to on my end to conclude, something to keep in mind for the question I'm throwing to all our future panelists as well, is what is the tipping point between future presence and infrastructure and the need to protect the environment, right? What is the sort of human mass tipping points in terms of tourism, in terms of science, in terms of presence, before we need to ask ourselves the question, are we endangering the environment by being too much present in a changing Antarctic? So I think this concludes our first panel. It was a brilliant discussion. Thanks so much for your time, Nengye, Klaus, Anne-Marie, and Evans. I think we can all join them in a round of applause, and I look forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you.
It was fun. Off we go.
Thank you to our outstanding panelists. As you can tell, we assembled the global experts on Antarctica up here, and I'm so proud that Anne-Marie, Evan, and Matt are all affiliated with the Wilson Center. What a fantastic discussion. So interesting. Thank you so much. We will now move to a coffee break. We started a little bit late. I'm going to make up some time on this coffee break. So instead of 20 minutes, we're going to take 10 minutes. It will be a giddy-up coffee break. Please be back here in 10 minutes for Deputy Administrator Bavishi of NOAA. Thank you very much. Our next keynote speaker, Janie K. Bavishi, is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and Deputy NOAA Administrator. In this role, Ms. Bavishi is responsible for providing agency-wide direction with regard to climate resilience, fisheries, coastal and ocean programs, including efforts related to NOAA's implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. She's a distinguished expert in the field of climate adaptation and resilience, and most recently served in the New York City Mayor's Office as Director of the Office of Climate Resilience, where she oversaw the implementation of climate resilience strategies for the nation's largest city. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Administrator of NOAA, Bhavishi. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Pincus, and thank you to the Wilson Center and all of the co-sponsors for hosting this event. Good morning. It's an honor to be here and to participate in this important first-of-its-kind conference. As NOAA's Deputy Administrator, as Dr. Pincus mentioned, I'm focused on proactive climate adaptation and resilience, and healthy and resilient oceans and coasts, our blue economy, and sustainable fisheries, priorities that align well with the U.S. interests in the Antarctic region. We like to say that NOAA is an environmental and climate intelligence agency. We are a global leader in measuring, observing, modeling, archiving, and delivering data and information on the Earth's changing environment. Our weather and climate products and services give policymakers the tools that they need to make informed decisions when planning for the future. This type of work is critical in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. Earlier, Dr. Lubchenco and Dr. Brooks noted how the region plays a major role in the global climate system, how research there allows us to study long-term climate trends, and how changes there, such as the collapse of ice shelves, reduced sea ice, and heat uptake by the Southern Ocean, can have far-reaching effects that we need to understand in order to plan for a climate-resilient future. Studying these local changes also helps us provide the scientific expertise to achieve meaningful conservation and protection of the complex and vulnerable ecosystems of the region. In order to carry out our mission, we rely on the support of our partners, both domestic and international. From collaborative research programs to sharing facilities and infrastructure, these partnerships enable our efforts to observe and analyze these remote environments. For decades, Antarctica has provided a model for successful scientific and global cooperation, and we need to ensure that those principles remain at the forefront of all Antarctic activities and policies. Environmental observations and data from Antarctica, from atmospheric data to land and sea ice measurements to ocean observations, play a key role in helping us understand global climate and ocean dynamics. Due to its remote location, Antarctica, and especially the South Pole, is largely free of local pollution sources. Therefore, the atmosphere there is representative of true background atmosphere. That is, it is uninfluenced by local human activity. The South Pole Observatory is one of 4 NOAA atmospheric baseline observatories, from which numerous in situ and remote atmospheric and solar measurements are conducted. NOAA has maintained a year-round presence there for over 50 years. Using our records, we can track long-term trends, seasonal variations, and cycles of critical atmospheric components, such as greenhouse gases. This data is essential for our understanding of the main drivers of climate change, such as CO2 and methane. Atmospheric measurements in Antarctica also help to lead what is often regarded as the most successful global environmental treaty ever, the Montreal Protocol. In the 1970s, scientists began warning that man-made chemicals were harming the ozone layer. But it wasn't until the Antarctic ozone hole was discovered that the world came together to regulate ozone-depleting substances. NOAA and its predecessors have been conducting ozone measurements in Antarctica since 1961, and by comparing current ozone levels to the pre-ozone hole era, we have developed an index that tracks the slow recovery of the Antarctic ozone hole. We also study how climate change is impacting Antarctica's ice environments, as local changes can have far-reaching effects on the rest of the world. Over the last 50 years, atmospheric and oceanic warming has led to increased ice melt and the destabilization and collapse of some Antarctic ice shelves. Ice shelves act as barriers for the land ice behind them, that is, glaciers and ice sheets. And when the shelves disintegrate, the glaciers are free to flow faster into the ocean. When that land ice melts, it contributes to global sea level rise. NOAA, along with many interagency partners, works to project future sea level rise and its impacts on coastal communities. And ice loss from glaciers and ice sheets is expected to be the major source of future sea level rise. Since Antarctic ice sheets account for 90% of all of the ice on Earth and contain enough water to raise global sea levels by 200 feet, even small changes to the icy environments can have substantial consequences. It is essential to improve our understanding of the changes to Antarctic ice shelves and ice sheets so that coastal communities throughout the world can adequately plan and prepare for the impacts of potential ice loss. Another dramatic change we are witnessing is the decline in the extent and duration of annual sea ice. Sea ice around Antarctica reached the lowest extent ever observed this past February, and the previous record low was observed in February of last year. NOAA satellites play a significant role in measuring sea ice concentration, and NOAA works with the National Snow and Ice Data Center to assess trends and anomalies in sea ice extent. In contrast to the Arctic, Antarctic sea ice has not exhibited a significant long-term declining trend. However, since 2016, sea ice extent in Antarctica has mostly fallen below the previous 30-year average, and this might point to the start of a longer-term trend related to ocean and climate changes. More time, data, and research is needed to understand the impacts of warming on Antarctica's sea ice, but this work is crucial, as sea ice plays a critical role in supporting the local ecosystems, and it affects Earth's climate by reflecting sunlight back into space rather than absorbing it. The Southern Ocean also plays a significant role in the global climate system and global ocean dynamics. It is a key driver of the ocean conveyor belt, the global system of currents that distribute heat and nutrients across the planet, which helps regulate our climate and supports ecosystems and marine living resources. The Southern Ocean also absorbs a disproportionately large amount of excess CO2 emissions and heat from our atmosphere, acting as a vital buffer for our climate. This uptake of heat, along with increasing freshwater inputs from sea loss, has the potential to alter the process of driving the ocean conveyor belt, thus impacting the global climate system. NOAA has partnered with NSF and NASA to support the Southern Ocean Carbon and Climate Observations and Modeling Project, which aims to characterize the impacts of these changes on the Southern Ocean, its ecosystems, and the wider effects of Earth's carbon and climate cycles. The project utilizes Argo floats, autonomous free-drifting profile floats, to collect observations through the entire Southern Ocean. Using this information, scientists, including experts from NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, are able to generate high-resolution models that improve our understanding of the Southern Ocean's dynamics that help us predict future changes to Earth's climate and biogeochemistry. In addition to helping us understand the global climate system, scientific research in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean helps inform conservation efforts and management policies for the local ecosystems. These ecosystems teem with diverse life, from phytoplankton to blue whales to seabirds, penguins, and seals. But across the board, this life is experiencing habitat changes due to climate change and fishing activities. For example, as has been noted several times already, emperor penguins are facing the threat of extinction, and we need to continue pushing for their protection. Scientists from NOAA Fisheries have conducted annual surveys in Antarctica for more than 30 years and have developed innovative technologies, including autonomous and remotely piloted instruments, that help detect and monitor these changes. NOAA's Antarctic Ecosystem Research Division within the Southwest Fisheries Science Center manages and implements the U.S. Arctic Marine Living Resources programs, which focuses on interactions between the environment, the Antarctic food web, particularly krill, fish, and the predators that rely on them, and commercial fisheries. By studying the complex relationships between populations and changing ocean conditions in the short and long terms, this research helps manage living marine resources sustainably. The program is internationally recognized for implementing the ecosystem-based management approach for Southern Ocean fisheries, linking changes in the region's climate and human activities to the productivity of the Antarctic marine ecosystem and promoting informed management decisions. This approach offers a flexible and adaptive management framework for these important ocean resources. One of the principal missions of the Antarctic Marine Living Resources Program is to provide the scientific information that supports decision-making by the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR. Established in 1982, CAMLR is an international treaty that seeks to manage Antarctic fisheries with the goal of preserving species diversity and the stability of the entire Antarctic marine ecosystem. It is part of the Antarctic Treaty System. By monitoring and predicting the effects of harvest activities and climate impacts on targeted and protected species, scientists from NOAA, NSF, and other U.S. agencies have provided critical information to policymakers that inform U.S. initiatives and positions in CAMLR. The science has contributed to decisions related to fishery management, bycatch, and marine protected areas and other environmental protections. In recent years, one of the major initiatives within CAMLR has been the establishment of a representative system of marine protected areas, also known as MPAs. These MPAs are designed to provide representative protection of different habitats and bioregions to mitigate or eliminate potential ecosystem threats from fishing without necessarily excluding fishing activities, and to support existing and future scientific research and monitoring so that we can better understand the range of variables that affect the health of these ecosystems, including climate change. The U.S. has both supported and led these efforts, and NOAA has provided scientific and policy expertise to aid in the planning process of NPAs. These efforts align with our domestic and global goals of conserving and protecting at least 30% of the ocean areas by 2030, as well as the aims of the High Seas Treaty, which the U.S. just signed last week. To date, these efforts have resulted in the establishment of 2 high seas marine protected areas, the South Orkney Island Southern Shelf MPA and the Ross Sea Region MPA, which CAMLR established in 2009 and 2016, respectively. These are great achievements. The South Orkney Islands MPA was the world's first international MPA, and the Ross Sea Region MPA is the largest marine protected area on the planet. However, progress has stalled since 2016, mainly due to politics. CAMLR has failed to adopt the research and monitoring programs of either of these 2 established MPAs, and proposals for additional MPAs around Antarctica have been met with objections and hurdles that have prevented their establishment. It is critical that the U.S. continues to advocate for marine protected areas in the region, as these provide the best opportunity to sustainably manage this vulnerable and important ecosystem and the marine living resources of the Southern Ocean. Before I conclude, I want to recognize that all of the work that I've highlighted would not be possible without the collaboration and partnerships we have with other U.S. agencies and institutions and other national Antarctic programs. For example, NSF provides the infrastructure for scientific operations at the South Pole Observatory, including a state-of-the-art science building. We share a mandate with NASA to measure and report on the Antarctic ozone hole. We partner with NSF, NASA, and the Air Force and other European operational satellite agencies on the Joint Polar Satellite System Common Ground System at the McMurdo Station in Antarctica, which is a combination of satellite reception and communication assets. And as I've already noted, we work with several American academic institutions and international partners to observe, analyze, and model environmental conditions in the Southern Ocean. Working in the remote and harsh conditions of Antarctica and the Southern Ocean requires dedication, innovation, and close cooperation. Efforts there have exemplified what can be achieved through scientific and global cooperation, and maintaining those ideals is more important now than ever. By continuing to observe and analyze the changes taking place in Antarctic environments, we can improve our understanding of the global climate system, plan for future impacts, and protect the local ecosystems. The scientific work in Antarctica is essential for realizing a climate-resilient future, and NOAA looks forward to continuing their support for U.S. and international efforts there. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Administrator. I'm happy now to introduce our next panel on U.S. national interests in Antarctica. Chairing this panel is Ambassador John Negroponte. You may not know that his long and distinguished government career included serving as Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, but it is true, and we are grateful to him for leading the discussion today. Joining also is Dr. Kelly Faulkner, who recently served as Director of the Office of Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation from 2012 to 2021, Elizabeth Kim, Director of the Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs at the State Department, and Dr. Hila Levy, Assistant Director for Ocean, Polar, and Natural Security in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Panel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and one thing that wasn't mentioned is that I was also Deputy Assistant Secretary in earlier years from 77 to 1980, when in charge of fisheries, when we held the 20th anniversary conference of the Antarctic the implementation of the Antarctic Treaty. So I have a perspective that admittedly is a bit dated, but I think at the same time that might help us have both a little perspective and get some sense of what has been enduring about the Antarctic Treaty System. I mean, there were quite a few differences back then, perhaps most notably the fact that there were only 12 consultative parties when we were meeting, and now I don't know how many parties. 50?
I'll tell you.
All right, somebody will answer that question. But one of the instruments that we negotiated during my watch, and Tucker Scully, who was head of the Oceans and Polar Affairs at that time, and David Colson, who was our legal advisor for OES, Oceans, Environment, and Science at State, were the ones who negotiated over a couple of very intense night of talks. I heard said just earlier that the agreement went into effect in 1982, but we actually negotiated the language of that agreement in 1978. I got to say, being both Deputy Assistant Secretary and Assistant Secretary for that bureau in the State Department were probably some of the most interesting and exciting pieces of work that I ever had an opportunity to do during my 44-year government career. And one of the things that really appealed to me tremendously was there was wall-to-wall negotiations. That's all we did. And I cut my teeth, really, on negotiating fisheries agreements and other related agreements. One, I don't want to go through the litany of what we think we accomplished back then in OES, but I do want to mention one accomplishment, and it, I believe, was when, yes, it was when I was Assistant Secretary. My deputy, Richard Benedict, who some of you might know, he wrote a book called Ozone Diplomacy. He was our deputy in the Bureau for Environmental Affairs, and between his negotiations and my kind of steering the interagency process back here, mind you, during the height of the Reagan administration, but with the avid support of Secretary of State George P. Shultz, we managed to sign the Montreal Protocol for the protection of the stratospheric ozone layer. And I think in some respects it's arguably the first effective global agreement for countering greenhouse gases. And it's still alive in various forms today. So we always were very pleased about that accomplishment, and it gives you some kind of idea. And part of the reason was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the ozone hole was over Antarctic, was it not? Not over the Arctic. And so it was, I mean, one of the impetus for negotiating this agreement was that hole up there and the desire to fill it. My last point before going to our panelists, when it comes to what United States interests are in Antarctica, President Eisenhower was a very wise gentleman, and this happened on his watch. And I believe that he had a personal hand in the decision to pursue the Antarctic Treaty, and he simply did not want the Antarctic to become an area of Cold War competition. And the best way they could think of achieving that was to reserve that part of the world for scientific research, put claims, territorial claims, not abolish them, not change them, but put them in sort of a state of suspended animation. And as you all know, I think there's 7 claimant states, and then there were 2 spaces on the Antarctic continent reserved for the United States and the Soviet Union, but we've never pursued that. So with those few words of introduction, I'd like to turn first for her remarks to Hila Levy.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Yeah. And thank you so much to Becca, to the Wilson Center, to the organizers and sponsors for having me here. Having dedicated most of my professional life to the Antarctic, first as a scientist there and then dabbling as a historian and now as a policy maker here, it's incredibly meaningful to be able to have this focused discussion here in Washington and online. And I'm delighted to be on this panel with two incredible women whom I hold in such high esteem and have had the blessing to be able to work with. As we've heard earlier today with Professor Brooks's talk, there have been distinct shifts in history and over time in how Antarctic powers viewed access, claims, and concepts of sovereignty with respect to the continent. And though many historians do view the Antarctic Treaty's development purely through that Cold War lens, I'm glad we have had some historians earlier today who have thought through some of the oft-forgotten history because it's helpful to recall how pre-existing and pre-war claims, stated doctrine, and World War II era security concerns ultimately guided the United States' Antarctic policy. There was a fear of Nazi German activity in the late 1930s and 40s, highly linked to the global trade in whale and seal oil, and concerns of European meddling in a Monroe Doctrine delineated Western Hemisphere, which gave us much of the underlying foundation for what would ultimately become this first arms control treaty with the Soviet Union, the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, following the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 58. The creation of and the persistence of the Antarctic Treaty was never preordained. The office I work at today, the National Security Council, in its first few weeks of operation in 1947, began studying what to do about Antarctica. The United States did not want conflict among its allies or in its own hemisphere, and it was seeing increasing tension between Argentina, Britain, and Chile. We talked about the shots that were fired. People don't remember that history sometimes. All amid naval operations that the United States was conducting to test out its military operability in cold weather and ice-covered regions. The U.S. interagency deliberated, and deliberations is what we specialize in at the NSC, but we deliberated along with our allies in many conversations for more than a decade on what was a conundrum around Antarctic governance before the final push of a possible Soviet permanent base and presence in Antarctica sealed convictions on the need for a freeze-in claims and assurances for a demilitarized, denuclearized zone in the Antarctic. And we've all benefited tremendously from that unique model of governance, which set the stage for the Outer Space Treaty as well. This is a tremendously important region of the world for all the reasons we've heard everyone mention today. As Dr. Lubchenco and as Deputy Administrator Bavishi said, what happens in the Antarctic doesn't stay in the Antarctic. This is all a global, interconnected system. It's always been that way, but it took great investment in research and discovery to really try to understand that. And it's just the tip of the pun-worthy iceberg in our understanding of the significance of Antarctica to humankind and the continuity of our way of life under a changing climate. So when asked to talk about U.S. interests and what we consider the region's major draws to be, that has also changed over time. These variations, I think, can be attributed to three main changes. First, the resource needs of humanity have changed in the human history of Antarctic interaction. We no longer need seal skins or whale products. Thankfully, we have some alternatives for that. And our modern society is increasingly concerned with protein demand, which is making our management over Antarctic krill and other fisheries essential. We're reliant on spaceborne communications, precision navigation and timing, weather forecasting, and climate modeling, which make Antarctica's strategic location important in terms of the ground-based space infrastructure. Second, our continued technological advancements have changed the ability to reach, access, sustain, and explore the Antarctic. We've improved icebreakers, runways, modular construction techniques, tracked vehicles, and more, so we don't need sled dogs anymore. And they're banned. Improved communications makes it easier to carry out research and to have more reliable emergency medical and logistical support, which has also, of course, increased the accessibility to tourism. And we can also beam data across the region more reliably, though we still need significant improvements and investments in areas like undersea cable connectivity to increase our bandwidth and transmission capacity. The third historic driver, though, is that shifting geopolitical considerations that our preceding panel discussed: competition, territorial claims, and treaty-based cooperation. That spillover as Professor Dodds mentioned. I would argue that while military or economic power are essential measures of a nation's influence in most parts of the globe, it is elements like presence, science, and logistics that draw significant national investments as the evolving measures of power and prestige in the Antarctic. And these historical global trends are now supplemented by the additional driver of climate change impacting everyone worldwide, but also increasing the area of Antarctica that might become ice-free in the future. And it's interesting to think about what a 22nd century greening or less ice-covered Antarctica would mean for the treaty. I think that's interesting, and as we consider how resource needs would shift or technological advances in geopolitics will impact us in the future, potentially increasing the desire of other players for Antarctica's resources and the continent's accessibility. In any case, we must continue to be present to perform the best science, nurture the best scientists, develop the technologies that will facilitate the safest research of greatest benefit to humankind, and to be tireless advocates for the effectiveness of the treaty system, even when it is hard. It is hard. I know that Dr. Kim will tell us about that. The National Security Strategy statement last year, where I quote, "We will promote Antarctica's status as a continent reserved for peace and science in accordance with the provisions of the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, end quote, is not a throwaway comment. It is the first time that a national security strategy in this country has ever mentioned this vital 10% of the planet, and it is with good reason. Not just because it is a national security concern or that we're securitizing Antarctica, but because it is a vital part of what it means to be the United States, to sustain the rules-based order, and to tackle collective challenges as a core part of our foreign policy. It becomes more important every day for us to show that the United States leads with presence and purpose in the Antarctic and Southern Ocean. And I'm honored to be able to speak to that today and turn it over to one of our exceptional diplomats who does just that. Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Right. Let me continue. Wow, it's going to be tough to come after that. Excellent opening remark. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Elizabeth Kim. I'm the director of the Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs. Thank you to the Wilson Center for organizing this event. I'm learning a lot already. It's quite possible that I am the newest person in the room to Antarctic law and policy. I'm going to keep my notes close by, and I have to make sure not to make any mistakes so that my former boss, Evan, is proud of me. So I'm sure there are many people in the room who will correct whatever I might get wrong, but I'll do my best. So I have been the director for a little less than a year and a half, and I've spent a lot of my energy on the High Seas Treaty, the new BB&J agreement, which I'm delighted to say the United States signed last week when it opened at the UN for signature. But I am equally delighted to be joining our Antarctic team now to attend the Camelar meeting in October, I hope. Now that I'm digging into this fascinating portfolio, I can see why people who work in and on Antarctica absolutely love it. As we've heard, that it's huge. It's almost 1.5 times the size of the United States, and the ocean waters covered by the treaties are about 10% of the global ocean. As we've heard this morning, it's globally important ecologically, scientifically, politically. There's no indigenous population. Territorial claims are held in abeyance under the treaty, the Antarctic Treaty. It's been designated as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. Commercial mining is prohibited. Fishing, tourism, and other activities are all carefully regulated to minimize environmental impact. And world-class science is done by thousands of people, often collaboratively among many different countries, in this most incredible and inhospitable environment. I personally did my PhD on corals in the Caribbean. I can't even imagine what it would be like to do my work in Antarctica. And on top of all that, on-site inspections can be done by consultative parties to assure that there is compliance with environmental and security provisions. So it's a fascinating part of the globe, and it's a fascinating part of international law. So in these opening remarks, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why it's so important to the United States, this area. Talk a little bit about the Antarctic Treaty System. We've already heard some about it, but I'll just give a little bit more detail on that, and then summarize the core U.S. interests in the region. So why is Antarctica important to the U.S.? As we've heard this morning, the United States has always been a leader in Antarctic international law and policy. We spearheaded the negotiations that led to that Antarctic treaty. We play a major role, we've played a major role in negotiating the treaty, which was signed in Washington, and we continue to play an active leadership role in all aspects of the Antarctic treaty system. Secondly, of course, it's a huge place on the planet, and it's critically important, as I mentioned, ecologically, scientifically, and politically. And third, the U.S. has the largest presence on the continent. We operate the largest station. We have and regulate the most tourists to the region. We've conducted the most inspections. We are the largest importer of krill and toothfish harvested in the Southern Ocean. And we conduct a significant amount of the research that underpins the management of the fisheries and the justification for establishing marine protected areas. Therefore, it is clearly in our interest to continue to promote and ensure peace, security, science, and environmental protection and conservation in the region. So let me just give you a little bit more detail on the three treaties. I'm sure you're all dying to hear the details on this. As we heard this morning, there's the Antarctic Treaty System, which primarily includes the Antarctic Treaty, its Protocol on Environmental Protection, and the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, CAMLR, as well as all the legally binding measures under those instruments. So the Department of State leads participation in the Antarctic Treaty System with active engagement and participation of other agencies, in particular NSF and NOAA. The Antarctic Treaty entered into force in 1961. Right now there are 56 parties, of which 29 are consultative parties. So only the consultative parties can take place in decision-making, and the consultative parties are the original 12 signatories of the treaty, which includes the U.S., and those additional states that demonstrated their interest in Antarctica by conducting substantial scientific research activity there. The treaty applies to all areas south of 60 degrees south latitude. It guarantees freedom of scientific research in Antarctica and prohibits military and nuclear activities with rights of on-site inspection by consultative parties to assure compliance. As we've heard this morning, it freezes previously asserted claims to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica, prohibits new claims, and provides that no acts or activities carried out while the treaty is in force may constitute the basis of a claim. So in essence, the way the treaty deals with these territorial claims minimizes the possibility that disputes over the claims will erupt and interfere with the science.
A quick two-finger question. What happens if some leader of the United States in future years decides that we want to occupy the space that's been reserved for us? What are the implications of that?
Well, the United States has reserves the basis of a claim, but
Yeah.
we have never made a sovereignty claim.
But what if we decided to make one?
I will leave that to other commentators to discuss.
That would be
Ambassador.
contrary to the treaty.
Yes, that would be contrary to the treaty.
Well, I mean, you know, if you want to buy Greenland, maybe you want to. I'm just saying. It might occur to somebody.
The second treaty I want to talk about is the protocol. This is the protocol to the Antarctic Treaty. It's a protocol on environmental protection. This entered into force in 1998. There are 43 parties, including the United States. This is what designated Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. It prohibits any activity relating to mineral resources other than scientific research, and it provides a comprehensive framework for assessing environmental impacts.
And when was that passed?
Antarctica. It entered into force in 1998.
Okay.
And then the convention, the CAMLR Convention. This convention entered into force in 1982. There are 37 contracting parties, of which 27, including the United States, are members of the Commission. So the Commission is able to take part in decision-making of the Commission and the Scientific Committee and contributes to the budget. So the difference between the contracting parties and the Commission is any state that is interested in research or harvesting activities under the Convention can join the treaty and be a contracting party, but the Commission is only open to contracting parties that are engaged in research or harvesting activities under the Convention. So and one other difference, the Kamilar Convention applies not only to the living resources and the marine living resources south of 60 degrees, but also to some resources in other areas a little bit north of this, which form a part of the Antarctic marine ecosystem. And just quickly, I think we've heard all this morning as well, but the core U.S. interests in the United States are under the U.S. Antarctic policy. Antarctica, established by treaty as a zone of peace and international cooperation, is to be maintained as a relatively pristine reserve devoted to scientific research. So our interests are in protecting the relatively unspoiled environment and its associated ecosystems, preserving and pursuing unique opportunities for scientific research to understand Antarctica as well as global physical and environmental systems, maintaining Antarctica as an area of international cooperation reserved exclusively for peaceful purposes, and assuring the conservation and sustainable management of the living resources in the ocean surrounding Antarctica. And with that, I will be happy to turn the floor.
So before you do, just question then. So really, how different is this from 1959? I mean, zone of peace, cooperation, scientific, and so forth. Maybe you could say that what's happened since then is the inclusion of protecting the Antarctic environment has become more prominent in the thinking about and the implementation of the Antarctic Treaty. Would that be a correct statement?
I would say
corrected?
I would say that is true, and I would say that the impacts of climate change have put a new layer of urgency on top of these environmental protection interests that we all have. And
In our time, Tucker Scully used to give me lessons about rational use, which I don't think we're applying quite as rigorously now as we did at that time. And that's why we negotiated a Mineral Resources Convention, and which you don't mention. And I don't know whatever happened to it. Did we ever submit it or not?
You look like you want to add.
What happened?
In the 1980s, it was sort of the first instance where environmental protection really came into play in terms of stakeholder engagement with the treaty system. And so as the treaty was entering for signature in Australia, Australia and France actually withdrew from the preliminary version of what was then CRAMERA, the Convention on the Resources and Mineral Resources Activities. So around 1988, that fell apart, and that was the impetus for actually negotiating and bringing together the environmental protocol. And so the environmental protocol signed in Madrid in 1991 came about as a result of all of that action.
Okay, so the Mineral Resources Convention, of which we had negotiated a draft, fell to the weight of the environmental interests, right?
Well, it fell to the weight of the interests of the states negotiating.
Yeah, right.
And there's now a mining ban in the
Also,
protocol.
okay, an absolute ban.
An absolute ban. Exactly.
So you got one thing to mention in the atmosphere back in the time that I was Deputy Assistant Secretary and when I was running OES. There was a theory out there from the oil industry, which actually promotes this theory almost constantly, that we're running out of oil. And that the world we weren't going to have oil at the end of the 20th century unless we did something about it, right? So I think that was part of the impetus for trying to get a Mineral Resources Convention. But we wanted to put in, I haven't gone back and looked at the language, pretty high environmental barriers to entry into that kind of business. In fact, we thought it was going to prevent people from wanting to go and exploit oil in Antarctica. So, but anyway, the problem was taken care of in a different way, an absolute prohibition. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Except for scientific activities.
No. But except for what?
Scientific activities.
Yeah.
That might include.
In terms of exploration.
Yeah. Right. Got it. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Kelly Faulkner. Happily retired as of January. You will notice people have mentioned the National Science Foundation several times in their remarks, but they're conspicuously absent here. I had 14 years of experience with NSF, a couple years as a program officer in the Antarctic sciences realm, and then as the director of the Office of Polar Programs for nearly a dozen years. I finished out my career with 18-month stint at the State Department in the Office of Science and Technology Cooperation, which was very eye-opening and a great experience. But so for those of you who are not familiar with NSF, by the way, I should say, I think people would want to have been here from NSF, but they're in a period of time where they're about to compete a contract for the logistic support of the program, and they have to be very careful about where they appear in terms of potential conflicts of interest and so forth. So I'm very sorry that we don't have a whole number of NSF people who have plenty of expertise and really are the people that will be in the know. I'm almost 3 years out of the detail in the know, so do forgive me for that. So for those of you not familiar with NSF, the National Science Foundation is an independent federal agency that was founded in 1950 by Congress, and they established this agency to progress the progress of science, to advance national health, welfare and prosperity, and secure national defense. So NSF fulfills this mission chiefly by funding competitive scientific grant awards in areas of science and engineering and education related to such. So in the case of Antarctica, NSF has a special responsibility to not only fund competitive grants to fund science there, but also by Presidential Memorandum 6646, and that goes back to 1982, to be the single point manager for the U.S. presence in Antarctica on behalf of the nation, and that's for the science presence. And so that includes budgeting and managing the entire U.S. national program, including logistics activities. And we support NSF and other agency science with the infrastructure. And we are charged, I say we, remember, I'm not formally there. NSF is charged with drawing on logistical support capabilities of government agencies on a cost reimbursable basis. We have had long-standing relations, for example, with the Coast Guard for icebreaking services that are absolutely needed in order to run our programs, with the Air National Guard for the unique in the world skied heavy lift aircraft, the LC-130s, long in the tooth and needing to be recapitalized. C-17s also help support the program and so forth. And you heard earlier from our NOAA colleague, and it's true with NASA and other agencies, that NSF works with these other agencies to support priority science missions of theirs as well. And we also are charged with using commercial support and management facilities where these are determined to be cost-effective and will not be detrimental to national interest. So excuse my use of we, I'm kind of stuck in that habit. But in any event, NSF has very significant responsibilities in supporting the program and has the pleasure of working with State Department and sitting in some of the fora that are just Elizabeth just described in detail, and so forth. So, I mean, we became the single point manager over time. Back in the International Geophysical Year, and the U.S. Was working under Admiral Byrd and others to mount a very large program. The national academies were drawn on to provide the scientific oversight for what we were going to do, and drew upon the very still nascent NSF to actually manage funding of science. And over time, as NSF grew in its budget and its capabilities to adjudicate competitive proposals and so forth, NSF took on the role of deciding what science should be conducted. and then added partners over time. Now, the Navy had the logistics responsibilities up until the 90s, and then that transitioned over to NSF to be the prime coordinator for everything, and the Navy stepped out of that
But does
role.
the Navy still provide the flights from Christchurch?
No, in fact, now...
It's an NSF plane now?
It's Air National Guard, LC-130s, and C-17s out of Lewis McChord Air Base in Washington State that provide that large aircraft.
And they're not Navy?
They are not Navy.
Okay.
Right.
That's too bad.
Okay, so I think I had some remarks I was going to say on, the importance of science. I do want to say just two quick things, and I think we've heard some wonderful remarks, starting with Dr. Jane Lubchenco this morning on the science and with others this morning. So, and we are going to have a science expert panel this afternoon, so I'll forego getting into detail there. I did want to say two things. I feel like my greatest frustration in overseeing the program for nearly a dozen years was the lack of public appreciation of the world's leading role that the U.S. has in Antarctica. And, the public mixes up the Arctic and Antarctic and, is sometimes surprised to know that we have a presence there. And I go, we have the best presence there, in fact. So how do you get around that issue? Because, in fact, to do anything, to move forward with anything, you really do need public support. Now, this is just my musing, and it didn't happen, but I was dreaming of, what's the most recognized logo in the world? Well, it's NASA. And I think the Nike swoosh goes back and forth. But in any event, I was thinking, why don't we have those wonderful little red parkas that we issue in every airport next to the NASA flight uniforms that, people can, have something concrete to relate to with the program. I do think we have a challenge there from a policy perspective to invest appropriately in making sure the public is fully aware. NSF does a lot of things with its limited funds in that regard, but there's probably not enough. And infrastructure, which has been raised multiple times this morning, is a real challenge. I feel, since I've stepped down from the program, there were always challenges. I appreciated the remarks earlier about, some of these things are not new. But I think the combination of COVID, which really made it impossible for programs to run for a year, created a bow wave of science that didn't get done. And it actually really sort of extended to 2 years because of the way the seasons work. And attendant with that was also the supply chain issues. And just at the time when I left, we were all excited because we had been funded to do a major overhaul at McMurdo. McMurdo Station's our biggest station. It's absolutely critical. And it had some buildings that were set up in the Navy days during the IGY when nobody imagined we'd be there now, over 50 years later. So long needed. But all of those challenges really thwarted the hoped for progress in this time period right now. And, scientists are understandably quite frustrated, I think, that, it looks like there's a lot of challenge going forward. They would like to see progress move faster than we can, or the programs can overcome right at the moment. But I think the key is we have to maintain the longer-term view. We absolutely shouldn't give up our number one spot in terms of our influence. Our scientific presence and influence is still very much the top. This is not to play down the importance of our partnerships with other nations in any way. That's a very important contribution, but we have enjoyed being in that number one position and doing some absolutely groundbreaking science in astrophysics. You've heard about climate science this morning, and that matters to everybody's lives, both the combination of some inevitable sea level rise that we're going to face, and you'll hear about that later. I believe Ted Scambos will speak to that, and other changes coming. I also like to remind people that there are very pragmatic things that happen in Antarctica that affect your everyday life. We monitor space weather there, and that has a strong potential impact on our communications infrastructure globally. We monitor seismics there. It's a unique spot in the world to be monitoring seismic activity in support of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So with all of those kinds of pragmatic things that do matter to everybody in the U.S. and humanity, in fact, to your everyday lives, I think, without any uncertain terms, we need to invest in the infrastructure needed to keep us in that #1 spot.
Thank you. Those are great remarks. Very much appreciated. I have a question. During COVID, did people winter over? Did some winter over?
Yes, indeed. And some people, at Palmer Station in particular, more than wintered over because there wasn't the same ability to get people in and out. So people made major sacrifices to keep the lights on during that period.
So I'd just like to say, NSF, it seems to me like your critical role hasn't changed, or NSF's critical role hasn't changed that much that I can tell from what you've said. But certainly, as far as policy and day-to-day implementation, I think in our bureau at State, we saw NSF as our key partner. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. His first name was Peter. I don't know, but it's quite a while ago. Huh? Peter Wilkness? Yeah. Peter Wilkness? Yeah. Anyway, he ran the program for a long...
It's one of my predecessors. Yeah.
Okay, yep. Yeah. And your director took strong interest. His name was John Moore. And actually, we traveled to Antarctica together and went to, and as you know, if you take a trip to Antarctica, usually you go around New Year's Eve, which is what I did. I remember flying to Los Angeles and then to Christchurch, and then we flew down to Antarctica itself. I'm trying to visualize a C-17 landing on that terrain down there. But yeah, I got to say, that's a trip of a lifetime.
I think that's one of the unfortunate problems with COVID. It made it difficult to bring people in roles like you're describing to Antarctica so that they have firsthand knowledge of how things operate, how amazing the program is, but just the challenges that were mentioned earlier as well.
We stayed at McMurdo Sound. I remember they told us, oh, you better bundle up as we were about to land there because it could be extremely cold. The sun was shining. It was about 35 degrees. It was really quite warm for Antarctica. But we went down to the South Pole, which was interesting. The animals down there perform for you. Somehow you go to some particular place and all of a sudden the orca whales start popping up, and the next thing you know, the penguins are gathering around. I don't know whether NSF was orchestrating that or whether they did it naturally, but we saw all the animal life. And we went on a Coast Guard icebreaker, which is a sort of quite a shaking experience, going up and down, pounding on that ice. But memorable, truly memorable. Although I've struggled ever since with what I think is sort of the unfortunate proposition that we have made shipbuilding costs so enormous that we can't even afford icebreakers anymore. They cost 4 times as much as to build them in Finland. And now, why not give NATO countries some kind of a shot at building some of these ships for us? I know people will jump, oh, you can't do that, it's sacrosanct. But what it means is we're going to just be able to build an infinitesimal, and that's what it is, number of icebreakers compared to other countries. I'm not expecting you to answer it. It's a legislative issue more than anything else.
Yeah, well, no, I think we're going to hear. I see some uniforms in the audience on that point a little bit later, but you touched upon something that over my dozen years was near and dear to my heart, getting those recapitalized. So I'm sure we're going to hear from the Coast Guard directly on where we're at with that. And we at NSF, while I was in that role for that entire time, we're looking at recapitalizing the research vessels. We're also ice-breaking capable research vessels. So important. I think that infrastructure, and particularly the icebreakers, are the key to maybe helping to maintain the rules-based order, in the sense that inspections are one way of doing that. And we need to have the capability of conducting those inspections efficiently and effectively.
You got to take on the Jones Act. I mean, whoever does it has got to do that. And, I'm not there anymore. and I don't think anybody's going to have me back. So I think it'd be a good idea to open the floor to questions. I'm calculating that we have until 12:30. Is that correct? About 15 minutes. So let's hear comments and questions. And I'll just randomly, yes? Are we supposed to get a microphone to you? Yeah.
Right in the middle. Thank you very much. Hi, yeah, I guess it's more of a comment that, again, in the early 90s, NSF took over some of the role from the Navy. And I think maybe a more general background for what's happened over the last few decades is that NSF has a military-sized job to do in managing Antarctica's logistics capability. They don't have a military-sized budget to do it with, and NSF might benefit from being able to have more of the logistics in their own control, operate some of these things, whereas right now they depend on the Air Force, smaller contributions from other parts of the government. And it makes for a lot of rules that make it difficult for NSF to operate freely, rapidly, nimbly, you might say, in Antarctica. I don't know if you all have any opinions about that or comments to make.
Anyone on the panel?
I appreciate that comment. I could understand that perspective. I feel, on the other hand, that NSF benefits from the incredible infrastructure that exists within our partners, be it military, be it another government agency, that would be out of reach, I think, in a lot of ways, for NSF to replicate. And I'm speaking about, personnel, training of personnel in highly specialized areas of equipment operation, et cetera. So I do agree with you that the budget hasn't kept pace with the needs. You are absolutely spot on that.
All right, there was another. I saw a lot of hands go up before. Yeah, in the back, all the way.
Perhaps you remember this treaty regarding the Arctic. Each country would have a division of the Arctic water area for exploration and obtaining mineral resources, fishing, whatnot, and we weren't interested in really agreeing to this treaty. But I wonder, China has protested that treaty, protested the ability of people in the area to more or less claim areas as their own for fishing and mineral resources, and they said they want to get in there, obtain fish and oil in the Arctic. I wonder, what are their feelings regarding the Antarctic? It's a little more remote, or maybe a little harder for them to reach it since they're in the northern hemisphere. Have they said anything about this or not? Have they agreed to all these conventions that you've mentioned?
Yeah, the People's Republic of China is a consultative party to the Antarctic Treaty System, and therefore is bound to the provisions therein, including the Environmental Protocol, which includes this general prohibition on mining. Although we do see countries such as Russia use their maritime infrastructure and vessels to do hydrocarbon sampling around the Antarctic in recent years. So that is the kind of activity that we do care for and monitor, but we do hope for the enduring ability to maintain the provisions that have all been agreed upon and to continue to further those protections in the construct that we've developed in this architecture of the system, which includes the treaty, the protocol, CAMLAR, and the SEAL Convention, which thankfully has not been a contentious thing to maintain over the past 40 plus years.
Yes, the lady, yes.
Hello, thank you to all the panelists. My name is Nikki Bransom. I work with the Pew Charitable Trusts, and we participate in the Antarctic Treaty and CAMLAR meetings as part of the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, an environmental group. ASOC, this group was consulted over the last few years as the U.S. government is developing its new Antarctic policy, and I was wondering if any of the panelists would be able to share any update on the progress for that policy. Thank you.
I think it's maybe, Ambassador, maybe you can share this feeling that it's always fascinating to be on the inside of government and have curiosities about whether we're doing anything. And so I'm very grateful that we have an amazing and incredible interagency process. And we, as part of our mandate under National Security Memorandum 2, consistently look to ensure that our policies are up to date and relevant to the current era. We were able to ensure that the national security strategy, again, reflected the importance of Antarctica to our foreign policy and to our environmental policy. That was a big success. We've also worked with our interagency partners to advance other Antarctic protections, including the Endangered Species Act amendments that were carried out by the Department of Interior. A big kudos to them. We've also worked to include CAMLAR in the G20. Most recently, there is actually a G20 statement. The joint statement, which is agreed to by China and Russia, indicates that we will work to advance an evidence-based and representative marine protected area regime, and we hope that they stick to that next month at CAMLAR. So we will continue to endeavor to ensure that Antarctica has the appropriate representation for its vital role to our planetary system and to global change. And we welcome all of our partners and stakeholders in kind of continuing to embark on that journey. Thank you.
So, I mean, the trick is, how do you find a good, effective way to involve non-governmental community in these deliberations? And I mean, it's a challenge, but we're a lot more used to it now as a government than we were 40 or 50 years ago. When they passed the Sunshine in Government Act, you used to not even have to tell anybody you had a little, advisory group that you pulled together or whatever. You can't do that anymore. You got to do it on some kind of systematic basis. But it pays dividends if you do it well, and you're willing to devote a bit of time to cultivating the non-government stakeholders in these the formulation of these policies. They're likely to know a lot more than the government officials do in general about the subject matter. Is there another question? I think you're running behind schedule, I've been told, and so maybe I should give back whatever time I probably don't even have left to. Okay, one last question.
Sorry, this is actually a comment, but because this session is about US interests in the Antarctic, I'll be participating this afternoon in the panel on rules-based order in practice in Antarctica. My name's Tony Press. I'm from Australia. The one comment I wanted to make is that even though Australia is a claimant state and the US doesn't recognise Australia's claim to Antarctica, Australia and the US have much in common. As a matter of fact, we have almost everything in common in our attitude towards Antarctica and its role in peace and security on the planet. And hopefully we'll get to some discussion about that this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, please express your thanks to our excellent panel. Very good. Thank you. Nice to meet you.